Well, live from New York, it's Wednesday morning. Yeah, it's Wednesday, right?
Yeah.
It's Wednesday. Okay, yeah. So, fantastic. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Paul Brody. I am still the EY Global Blockchain Leader in spite of any jokes that I said yesterday that fell flat. I'm still here. I still have a job, and I've been very careful not to check my email this morning. So, just in case I have any bad news. Yesterday was amazing. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the folks at Polygon who were the sponsor of the Polygon Nightfall launch party. That was an amazing event. We really rocked it like accounting firm style. We wrapped up promptly at 6:30 p.m. And we also had an amazing day. We had incredible videos, which I'm going to post from the ETH Finance Forum on Reddit that were really kind of thoughtful, big picture takeaways about the state of the crypto industry generally. And we had a set of amazing talks yesterday. And in fact, if you go to ey.com/blockchain summit, you can already see the day one replay. So it was a really terrific day. And we have, starting today, we have 3 days of a slightly different pitch. So yesterday, big picture, like lots of sort of big discussions about the history of DeFi, the history of monetary policy, the future of the organization. Starting today, we're moving on towards a set of what we call master classes. And the goal each of these days, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, is to dive deeply and thoughtfully into a couple of topics each day. So tomorrow, we're going to dive into public sector services and industrial operations. Friday is technology day. And today is all about finance and the token economy. And we've got 4 really great items for you this morning. First, we're going to have a really excellent panel on bridges. And to misquote somebody else, we rob bridges because that's where the money is. And then we're going to have a quick break, and then we're going to go. We've got a couple of excellent classes lined up. So the first is going to be on staking. So when the Ethereum ecosystem, when there's a merge and the shift to proof of stake, staking is going to start to become a major source of return. And so we're going to have an expert in the Ethereum merge and the staking ecosystem give us a talk, a really kind of a master class on that. And then we're going to dive into another master class on the art and some of the math and science of digital asset custody. Because if you're holding onto assets, if you're holding onto digital assets, you need to think about digital asset custody. And then we're going to wrap up today with a closing keynote from our friends at Fireblocks talking about digital asset infrastructure, right? What is happening in this ecosystem and how banks themselves are being reinvented. So we have an excellent lineup of discussions today. In addition to that, as we did yesterday, we have proof of attendance protocol tokens. Those are going to be visible from time to time during the day as a QR code or as a URL. You'll be able to go to get your your proof of attendance protocol tokens, and those tokens will be open for retrieval until 4 p.m. Eastern time today. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into our first panel. We have 3 incredible people lined up for our first panel, all on bridges and bridge security. The first person who's joining us is a gentleman named Andy Beal. Andy is a former EY rock star. We were kind of heartbroken to lose him, but he has an amazing new role. He is the ecosystem lead at Forta, which is a decentralized web security network for Web3. He's also the author of the 30,000 foot newsletter, which really sort of addresses and disaggregates trends in Web3. He is joining us from that security perspective. Secondly, we've got Niv Yehezkel. Niv is part of a stealth crypto digital security startup in Israel. He's a security researcher, 15 years of experience, hands-on in this industry. He is he's actually a CTO. He identified one of the major proof of stake bridge risks previously, and he's also joining a startup, or really co-founding a startup, to help companies and investors think through the end-to-end security issues. And then lastly, we have Karthik Salapuram. Karthik is a senior manager here at EY. He is a member of our blockchain team. He's one of our senior solution architects and protocol experts. And he has actually been working on bridge monitoring and bridge security for the last few months and has been in our blockchain team for, I think, now 5 years. So he's one of our deepest experts in security and solution design. So we have these three folks on the phone and in person with us. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask each one of them to start with a little bit of a big picture perspective, right? What is it that's important to understand about bridges and security? How do you make blockchain and DeFi work for you in a way that doesn't put you at risk? And I'm going to pass this over. I'm going to start with Andy Beal. And Andy, maybe introduce yourself and start sharing some of your kind of initial thoughts about bridges and security in the DeFi world.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. And thanks for having me on the panel. As you mentioned, I lead ecosystem at Forta. Forta is a real-time monitoring and threat detection network for Web3. So you can think about Forta like a giant security camera and alarm system for smart contracts. So what I wanted, I guess the way I wanted to answer this question was by sharing a framework that, so hopefully this is a good mental model that those listening can take with them, and it may help organize the discussion here too. So this is a framework that I'm going to borrow from Madit Gupta, the Chief Information Security Officer at Polygon, and I thought it was really helpful when I heard it. So this is what I've been using. So I break the bridge landscape up into three categories. So you have centralized bridges, you have proof of stake / multi-sig bridges, and then you have decentralized bridges. And they each have different risk profiles. And so I really quickly want to describe these. So a centralized bridge is essentially a hot wallet that straddles the fence between multiple blockchains, right? And there's a single entity, and it's oftentimes an exchange, a crypto exchange, straddling that fence, right? And they manage the liquidity on both sides. And Binance is probably the best example of this. And I describe it as a hot wallet because whoever the intermediary is that's sitting in the middle has to orchestrate the liquidity and the flow of funds back and forth, right? And for a centralized bridge, there really is no smart contract risk, right? There's sort of centralized operator risk. And so just like you have with hot wallets, the primary security issue is private key management and access controls and things like that, right? So all the Web 2 security risks that have existed for decades, right? The second category of bridges is proof of stake bridges. And these are like, I describe them like little blockchain networks that facilitate flow of funds back and forth between two or more networks, right? And instead of having a single entity like you did with centralized bridges sitting in the middle and controlling the flow of funds, you have a group, and that group can be 5 entities, it could be 9 entities, it could be 20 entities, whatever the group size, it's a group. And so you are trusting this group to secure that bridge. And they often involve multi-sigs or some form of escrow mechanism. And these bridges have the highest risk profile because there is a smart contract component to it. But because you have centralized entities that are also managing their respective keys and approval processes, right? You have all the Web 2 risks as well. So it combines all the Web 2 risks that you have with centralized bridges, plus all the smart contract risk that you get with, having on-chain controls. And so the risk profile, the risk surface area for proof of stake bridges is the highest. And as a result, they are oftentimes the ones that are, they receive most of the attention from hackers. And they are also involved in a majority of the exploits that we see out there. And Ronin was, the Ronin bridge hack was sort of the best example of a POS bridge that was exploited largely because the Web 2 security risks were not properly addressed. And then the third category you have is decentralized bridges, right? So this is all code. It relies on proofs to verify locks on one side and unlocks on the other. And this sort of has the highest technical sophistication from a code standpoint, but you don't have any of the traditional Web 2 risks with decentralized bridges, right? It's all smart contract code risk. So assuming you're doing everything you can on the code side, audits, formal verification, rigorous testing, things like that, you can put yourself in a good position. And I don't think we've seen an exploit of a fully decentralized bridge at this point. So that's the framework that I like to use to sort of organize the bridge landscape. And at least at this point, most of the risk and most of the exploits that we see are focused on the second type of bridge, which is that proof of stake bridge.
Fantastic, Andy. Thank you for sharing that. I want to actually turn now to Niamh, and Niamh, let's have you kind of share your initial perspective for the discussion.
Sure. So first of all, happy to be here. My name is Niamh. As Paul mentioned, I'm the CTO and co-founder of a Web3 security startup, which we recently founded. And the way I look at like DeFi and blockchains and bridges, like in general, is that from an attacker's perspective, because that's what I do. And in that sense, like you have DeFi protocols and blockchains storing lots of funds, so that makes them an ideal candidate for attackers. But yet we see like lots of attacks happening on bridges, or at least attempts. And I think this is because mainly bridges are special in the sense that they normally consist of another off-chain components that attempts to keep in sync two chains or more in sync. And normally, from an engineering perspective, that's a very hard thing to do. And that's very attractive for hackers to hack. And as a security researcher, the way I view bridges and the way like I look at the world is I try to categorize different things. So bridges for me are sort of like a double-sided oracle that once you manipulate it, you're able to like get two systems out of sync, and that can cause a lot of havoc. So this is, I think, what sets them apart, like from many different DeFi protocols or tokens that solely live on chain. And that nature of bridges, like living on two or more chains, having that off-chain component that attempts to synchronize state between them, also attracting lots of user funds because users love bridges because it increases like capital efficiency and enables interoperability. And moreover, I think bridges are complex in the sense that you have the philosophical multi-chain versus cross-chain discussion. And since bridges like connect the entire ecosystem, we also, like as users and as builders, need to account that a cascading effect, like when something happens on one chain, that has a cascading effect on the other. Like if you lock native tokens in one chain and you have like circulating wrap tokens like circulating in another chain, once that native token original chain is compromised, it immediately obviously affects the bridge and also the other chains, even if the bridge was like the code was written like was 100% secure. Given like as Andy give an example, like the Browning bridge. So for attackers, this creates like a massive attack surface because you have multiple contracts living anywhere. You can attack the network and you will be rewarded. You can attack the bridge, the off-chain components. And for users, I think gaining visibility into what bridges does and understanding their risk is something that is a must before even trying a bridge. So yeah, I think you have also liquidity bridges, which are also an interesting, more secure variant of bridges, but I think they're less popular today because they require like massive capital in place for initial liquidity. So yeah, this is like my general overview of bridges and why they're so attractive to hackers, and we see lots of exploits today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Niamh. So finally, let me turn to Karthik, my colleague. And Karthik, why don't you share? It would be great if you could share some of your initial thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Paul. This is Karthik. As Paul introduced, I've been working with EY for over 5 years and have spent a lot of time in security and dabble in a little bit of zero-knowledge proofs, which I've been doing over the past few years. Both Andy and Neve have given a great introduction to where bridges are playing an important role. I'll start off with rehashing some of the statements made by Vitalik last year in a Reddit post. Nominally, when we talk about 51% attacks on L1s, the assumption is that the L1 would completely break. But it's not necessarily slow. The argument is that even if there is a 51% attack, the attacker will not be able to propose a block which would invalidate the global consistency of the world state of the blockchain. And the same thing, even if there is a staked ETH or a 99% hash power that is introduced, that would still, as long as the remaining 1% is following the protocol rules, the overall state is not affected. Now, the question comes in, like, how does this affect with bridges? The issue with bridges is you can think of bridges as different areas of sovereignty, which need to be linked with some sort of a toll or some sort of a link between them both. In the case of, like, for example, in the case of Wormhole, the issue was that you have completely two different chains. You have Solana on one side, you have Ethereum on one side. Your user is taking their Solana or wrapping their Ethereum using Solana. And before it appears on Ethereum, user can actually complete a transaction, or attacker can complete a transaction on one side and revert the transaction on the other side. So what might, even if you have 100 ETH on one side, you might end up having only showing up as 60 ETH on the other side. This is one of, like, the more basic issues of bridges. But dialing down a little further, there are other issues as well with respect to interface compatibility and how you're coding and how the smart contract audits are taking place. I'll take a particular example for the Poly network hack. In the case of Poly network hack, when you do the cursory or some sort of forensic analysis, you notice that the hack was very simple in the sense that the function that was used to actually transfer the funds, that function itself was not generated as a proper interface compatible source. So this resulted in the hacker trying to modify the function, giving a new signature for the function with a completely different implementation, which allowed them to, like, siphon off billions of dollars away from the Poly network itself. So this is one such example where function signatures, all the trivial, need to be addressed and need to be carefully analyzed from a forensic basis itself. I'll give another example, like in the case of Wormhole and in the case of BZX, most of the times the projects are small and they don't have too much of either validators or too much of code contributors or too much of, say, even issues or bug reports. If you take the case of bigger projects like Solana or Ethereum, you notice that there are over 20,000 commits and, over 300 contributors in each case, like ranging from Solidity to Git to the Go Ethereum to even the Solana source code base. Whereas if you take Wormhole on the other side, you have like maybe 300 commits or like a few thousand commits with like 30 contributors, kind of leaving the attack surface for attackers to identify loopholes in the code itself. So overall, I think bridge security is paramount. And I think that in the future, more and more such issues would come up. And as both Neve and Andy mentioned, it is very important to have some sort of monitoring and some sort of toll booth, so to speak, when you're transferring collateral assets between, especially completely two different chains, say one is EVM compatible and one is not EVM compatible.
Excellent. So now we've got a little bit of, I'll call it a foundation for the conversation. Before I go on, I just want to say we are going to take some questions at the end of this. So if you are watching on the EY invitation, you should be able to put in questions and we're going to sort through them and filter some of them back before we're done. Now, we've established a bit of a level set. What I want to do is actually ask an important question, which is every time there's one of these big hacks, if you go onto Twitter, and this is where all the serious, thoughtful discussion online takes place, or maybe not. But if you go on Twitter or Reddit, what you hear a lot about is, hey, this wouldn't have happened if instead of using a bridge to a different blockchain, it was a bridge to a layer 2, say, within the Ethereum ecosystem. And I want to get a perspective like, is that really an answer? Is it really less risky? Are bridges inside of or layer 2 networks less risky than cross-chain bridges, or are there some very similar risks? And maybe I'll start that with Neve, if you want to kind of share a little bit of perspective there, that would be great.
Sure. So as a security researcher, I tend to categorize like every different sort of a component. So a bridge to me is sort of like a double-sided oracle, like the general case of bridge, and rollups to me, like and possibly to many others, like behave like a cross-chain bridge. only that rollups is sort of like a single-sided oracle as they bridge assets from layer 2 to layer 1. So as they like are built for other benefits such as scalability, and treats as the layer 1 as this consensus layer. And so I don't think that rollups like in specifically will guard throughout will not see any like other hacks on rollups as well. Like I think Optimism like had one incident, like a reported one, disclosure, and in general, like for hackers, when you add another line that does any sorts of things, and specifically when it's like cryptographically trying to prove something that happened, or if we're talking about optimistic rollups, adding any kind of line to any piece of code for hackers, that's just more attack surface. So in that sense, I don't think rollups are making things any less riskier, like inherently. And like in the general case, more philosophically, in a multi-chain world where we see today a lot of abstraction, even with rollups, I'm not seeing it like vanishing anytime soon, but who knows? Like you have this enormous ecosystem around other chains rather than Ethereum. And even with rollups, me personally, I don't think those ecosystems will vanish. In the near future, but even with alternatives built over Ethereum.
Fantastic, Niv. Thank you very much. Karthik, I know you have a point of view on this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll echo some of Niv's statements. To start off, I think rollups have definitely been one of the most promising and advanced forms of scaling solutions out there. And it's this, the concept of rollup is essentially to where a provider or the person who's actually rolling up the transactions actually computes or actually executes the transactions off chain, bundles them up, and then compresses them to the mainnet or to the L1 itself. So in this case, usually there are sequencers and validators involved. Sequencers are the ones who stake their ETH or stake their collateral in the form of a bond, and wait for the network or anyone on the network to submit what is known as a fraud proof. So unless until the fraud proof is submitted, the withdrawal actually doesn't happen. So this is a case in most of the cases in the optimistic rollups. What essentially happens is the burden of proof is not necessarily on the technology, but it's on the strain. The strain is actually on the validators or the validator set itself. So what that means is that you can, unless until a fraud proof is submitted, which actually proves the fact that there is an invalid state transition or invalid transaction state transition, the network itself cannot identify or process the transactions itself. In that sense, while it is quite neat in the sense that the data is always available, things can be reconstructed from whatever is compressed and submitted to the chain. Data availability problems are solved, but there is a longer withdrawal time, there's a longer latency, and there is a larger dependence on the overall network itself. On the other hand, we also have somewhat more novel and more advanced ZK rollups, which depend on zero knowledge proofs, which essentially use something called validity proofs. They are different from fraud proofs in the sense that there is no dependence on waiting for someone to submit a fraud proof, but instead there is an on-chain verification of the off-chain computed zero knowledge proof. This has significant benefits in that the data is available, it's cryptographically secure, and you're relying on the security of L1 itself for availability. The con is over here. The cons of ZK rollups, however, is that they are computationally very expensive and require some additional language, additional tooling, additional compilation techniques to actually commit those proofs or validate or even verify such proofs. Overall, I think that regardless of how rollups are, I think they are very promising in terms of how the space is evolving. As such, I think that rollups have definitely caused splinters or fragmentation in the community, with like different types of rollups coming up by various advanced and very smart groups of people, both cryptographers, mathematicians, and scientists alike. I think what would be necessary is a composability framework for multiple types of rollups. So just like how in other forms of scaling solutions, like in state channels, you have a dependence on underlying communication channel. I think that a similar idea could be adopted for composing multiple types of rollups to have some sort of new communication framework or communication standard, so that a rollup proof on one, sorry, a ZK rollup on one versus a optimistic rollup on other versus a ZK rollup on other all can communicate with each other. It will be some form of new form of gRPC or zRPC, so to speak. But I think that it's a very exciting space. I think that more and more such novelties might come out.
So, okay, I feel like I'm getting a little bit of mixed signals here. It sounds like Neve is maybe sort of a little bit skeptical that we'll have more security. I think Karthik sounds a little more optimistic. I don't know if you're just telling me what I want to hear, Karthik. But I do, before we go to questions from the audience, I want to go around one more time and just sort of ask, okay, is it going to get better? Because if I think back, and I'm a very old person, so I think back to the early days of the .com era, we had a lot of substantial breaches, and unfortunately, we seem to continue to have an incredible number of classic like Web 2 breaches as well. Although banking sector in particular seems to have found ways to handle some of those risks. I guess in using DeFi especially. So if I buy just regular tokens through like an institutional account like Coinbase or Kraken or some other entity, I feel like there's somebody there with me who's if got some responsibility, and they've got full-time experts on hand to think about security. When I go with DeFi, when I do a DeFi transaction, it's on me, because I can't get DeFi through any existing institutional provider. It's on me to understand all of the risks and manage all of my privacy and security. And I feel like that's more than I want to bear most of the time. So one of my key questions, and I'll start with Karthik maybe in this round. What's the best stuff happening now that should give us some optimism for the future? What's the most important developments that are going to pave the way for a more secure, lower risk future, particularly in DeFi, in the DeFi space?
Yeah, so I think a lot of exciting things are happening in DeFi space. We've seen that the market has just exploded over the last year itself, and with the uptick in the market in general in the DeFi space also comes with it a lot of security vulnerabilities and issues with the hacks itself. So, for example, if you take the case of the wormhole attack, or sorry, my bad, the Sky Mavis attack, the Ronin network attack, it's as Andy was pointing out, it's actually classic Web 2 issue, because the attackers were able to use like general social engineering based phishing attacks to actually figure out who the 4 validators are. Now it's a different story that why there are only 9 validators in the case of a Ronin network, but the attackers were able to figure out 4 validators, and then there was one exposed using because of an Axie DAO. So in this case, the issue was that the lack of sufficient number of validators or lack of sufficient diversity in the validators was the primary issue. I think apart from that, I think there is other issues like not being able to detect the valid events that get emitted from the contracts, or using wrong compiler versions or experimental compiler versions, and so on and so forth. I think what is promising though is that there are companies like Forta and Certic, which are using machine learning and advanced forensic techniques to identify where issues and vulnerabilities could be. So it would be a combination of on-chain monitoring, for early detection of any fraudulent activity, or monitors, which clearly would have helped Ronin network, because it almost took like 2 weeks to actually find the attack or actually find the issue. And apart from that, sentiment analysis, identifying the market volatility, and just generally getting a sense of static analysis as well, because static analysis is something that's somewhat missing in many of the smart contract ecosystems out there. So I think a combination of such advanced technologies and forensic tools can help secure the DeFi space. That being said, I think it's like all security, it's a cat and mouse game. So as attackers get better, security gets better, and I think eventually things would get better.
So Neve, I know you're working on a security startup. You definitely have to have a point of view upon this, and you've got to have a view that somehow important things are happening that will make this better, because otherwise you wouldn't be starting a company in this space.
Exactly, and even though it's not necessarily rollups or what will bring like security for all, the future is bright. So I think the way I view it is, when I analyze risk, like in DeFi, I break it down into like layers, and then attempt to solve each one layer at a time. And there is obviously no silver bullet like for security. So for instance, like for users, pre-transaction risks like the incident in BedgerDAO is very different than risks such as a protocol being like the beanstalk exploit, when the protocol suffered from a flash loan exploit that circumvented the governance. So in that sense, I think like the ecosystem is like trying to solve the security issues from different angles. So you have important efforts such as FORA that helps with on-chain monitoring. You have, I think, from the protocol side, like Gauntlet or Chaos Labs that help to build more economically secure protocols. So they try to solve the economic security side of protocols. And you also have like efforts such as protocols such as lossless cash that attempt to really try to blend in with the smart contract and solve it also security issues in the smart contract itself. So I think in general, like the ecosystem is trying to solve security from different kind of angles. Also us, we're a stealth mode startup building exactly those kind of solutions because we believe that security is a major issue and will be solved. So we are building tools to enable more secure access to DeFi, bridges, and generally like Web3. So yeah, lots of different exciting stuff happening in the ecosystem, and very optimistic.
Excellent. And Andy, I know you've got a point of view as well.
Yeah, and I'll focus on 2 points. I think the first is, and this is not specific to security too. You see this in other sort of aspects of Web3, especially in governance. Like, you know, this industry tends to start to reinvent the wheel. Because we're really excited about sort of building the next version of financial infrastructure and changing how things were done, and so I think that mindset it almost prevents us from sort of looking back and seeing if there's any, can we borrow best practices from Web 2 and sort of bring them into Web 3? And in most cases you can, right? There's a lot of standards and best practices and approaches that have been fleshed out over the last, 20 or 30 years. And I think a lot of that is being brought into Web 3 now. You're seeing a lot more frameworks and checklists and best practices. You're also seeing a lot of like Web 2 security professionals migrate into Web 3, which should, elevate the level of sophistication that we operate at across the board, which I'm really optimistic about. And I think all of this is important, right? Because if you think about the teams that are building protocols and bridges in these L1 and L2 networks, right? They're small startups. They don't have dedicated security teams, right? They likely will never have dedicated security teams in-house, right? So how do you solve for security when you're trying to operate in a decentralized fashion, right? So that's a unique question. But we can pull from a lot of these sort of established standards and practices. So that was one thing I wanted to say. The second thing, and Paul, you brought it up in this question, which is sort of the end user protection. So the other end of the spectrum, right? Users are on their own. There's really not a safety net. We put a lot of the burden of custody and security on the end user, who's sitting at their laptop or on their phone interacting with MetaMask, and it's really, really hard to know what you're interacting with. And so I think we will start to see the user interfaces will start to inform the user more about what they're doing, right? Are you interacting with a contract that was deployed yesterday? If you are, that's probably not a legitimate contract, right? And so basic things like that, right? Can we give users prompts, warnings, more data so that they can make informed decisions? Because right now, to your point, they're flying blind.
Andy, thank you so much. I will confess though, like I click OK so many times on my computer. I'm not sure that giving me more warnings will help. I think there needs to be like a warning like, hey, idiot. This one is a real warning. It's not just one that you click OK through. So we might need to have a more assertive user interface experience in order for me not to screw this up. But with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank my 3 brilliant panelists and apologize to the people who sent in questions through the internet. Andy, Neve, Karthik, thank you so much. And we'll be back. Wow. We'll be back in 5 minutes with an amazing session on staking. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul.
Hi, everybody. We are back. Thanks for rejoining us. I'm Paul Brody. I'm the global blockchain leader at EY. Today is an amazing set of discussions. And to drive our discussions in the deep dive into the financial services industry, I have recruited in a couple of excellent co-hosts to take you through the rest of the day. The first person I'm going to hand over to, and the person who's going to be your co-host and introduce our next segment and the next couple, is Karthik Solapuram, who was just on the last panel. And so with that, I hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Karthik. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Today we have our first session with Nix, our esteemed guest, who is the community steward for ETHStaker. She will be talking about staking, ETH 2.0, and the upcoming merge. And also hopefully address some questions as will I lose my old ETH? Do I really need 32 ETH? And so on and so forth. Over to you, Nix.
Great. So my name is Kayleen. Am I going to be able to see the slides?
Yes, I think if you press the
okay.
forward button, it should work perfect.
Oh,
And that should, yes.
perfect. Okay. So I'm here to talk about proof of stake and the merge. My name is Kayleen, but in the staking community, I go by Nixorikish, and I know that can be difficult, so let's rhyme it with licorice, or Nix for short. I'm an environmental scientist by training and by trade. I have been a staunch supporter of open source software since I was a teenager. I became interested in Ethereum in late 2016, early 2017, and I started learning about staking as a hobbyist staker in the ETHStaker community. I started contributing to and helping out in this community forum called ETHStaker. ETHStaker is a public good that supports all forms of staking, whether that's solo staking, pooled staking, custodial staking, staking as a service, all of which we will define and talk about. ETHStaker supports stakers and facilitates community involvement. It primarily promotes solo staking and decentralized forms of staking because those are the kinds of staking that best support the Ethereum network. It focuses on education, reaching out to the community, organizing community events, and helping people be ready to stake. An overview of what we'll cover is first we'll talk about what a consensus mechanism is, and then specifically what proof of stake is. We'll talk about what the beacon chain is and how it relates to what we know as Ethereum today, how all of this, proof of stake, the merge, will affect Ethereum. I'm going to go over what staking looks like and what your options to stake are. And then I'm going to preach a little about decentralization and why it's important and why you should let this significance influence how you interact with Ethereum. Before we talk about proof of stake, we have to understand what a consensus mechanism is. A consensus mechanism is a way in which the computers that make up the network talk to each other and decide and agree what messages to process and in what order. So we know that blockchains are essentially a publicly distributed ledger, and for all the computers on the network to agree on the transactions that they're incorporating onto it, they have to have a protocol that defines when what they're putting on the ledger is true, and that every other computer on the network is going to write the same thing on that ledger. There are different ways to do this. The most well-known is proof of work. Proof of work is what Bitcoin uses, and this is what Ethereum currently uses. It can be described as a race to figure out the right combination to a lock. Basically, a computer puts all its processing power towards solving a complicated math problem, and the first computer to solve it gets a reward and gets to add a block to the chain. Proof of stake is the consensus mechanism that Ethereum is moving to this year. It was pioneered by Peercoin in 2011, and currently other smaller blockchains are running on it. They all have some version of proof of stake. Ethereum's version of proof of stake has been in active research and development since 2014. There are a handful of other consensus mechanisms, including delegated proof of stake, proof of authority, proof of history, proof of capacity, but we won't get into those. And as of right now, they're not widely used by large market cap chains. So proof of work is where miners compete to solve a puzzle using their computer's processing power. Because the first miner to solve this puzzle is the one who gets rewarded, the amount of processing power matters. The more processing power, the better your chance of reward. Or put in terms of return on investment, the more you spend, the better your rate of return. Bitcoin mining used to happen in people's homes. It used to happen on people's home computers. It still does to a small extent, but it's not very profitable. Bitcoin mining mostly happens now in big mining, like gigantic mining operations. These operations are extremely resource intensive, and they require a lot of really expensive hardware. And all of that expensive hardware requires a lot of energy use. ASIC chip manufacturers are constantly coming out with newer, more expensive chips or more effective chips. And miners have to upgrade their chips or their GPUs or get left behind and be less profitable. So that ends up generating a lot of waste. Proof of work is what Bitcoin and Ethereum currently use, and it has used since their inception. It was an effective method to initially distribute these coins, Bitcoin and Ether, because it didn't take much to start mining, and people were doing it from their homes. People were mining with their gaming computers. Now, though, these big mining operations have put small home miners out of profitability, and there are a few that control a hefty portion of the Bitcoin hash rate. Hash rate is just the total combined computational power that it takes to mine and process these transactions. There was a news article in 2020 that estimated that 5 of these operations controlled 50% of the hash rate. So that's 50% of all new Bitcoin going to 5 operations. At this point, Bitcoin mining is a pretty centralizing process tending towards monopoly. And I don't think I need to explain that a monopoly undermines the point of a distributed ledger. So I know no one's unaware of the conversations that have been happening around crypto and policy debate. Every time it comes up, someone mentions that proof of work uses more energy than the entirety of the energy use of some small countries. This is obviously not great for adoption and for policies favorable towards Bitcoin or towards blockchain technology. If we want this to not be an uphill struggle all the way to widespread adoption, we need to address these criticisms. Addressing these criticisms is just pragmatic. So this is a mining, the Bitcoin mining or an Ethereum mining operation that I pulled off of a community forum for mining Ether. This particular setup cost $14,000. There isn't really a typical setup cost because of the fact that the more you spend, the more you make. But this person was generating anywhere between $100 and $500 a day in April of 2021 when they posted this. This bill is from somebody from the same forum with a smaller setup. And it shows that they are using 245% more electricity than their neighbors. And this problem never gets easier. The amount of processing power that it takes to mine transaction always goes up until all of the available supply is gone or no one else is mining. Ethereum's version of proof of stake has been in active R&D since 2014 and has been officially on the roadmap since sometime in 2015. A shift to proof of stake eradicates the need for mining, meaning there will be no more miners mining Ether. Broadly, proof of stake is a mechanism in which you put down a stake or a bond that allows you to validate blocks. This validator is instead of a miner. There's no competition in proof of stake. There's no arms race that leads to people needing to outcompete other validators. Instead of the first one to solve the puzzle being chosen to create the block creators are chosen pseudo randomly. You can't influence if you're chosen, and you can't it's not advantageous to try to predict who gets chosen. Proof of stake has much lower hardware and energy requirements than proof of work. A validator running 24/7 on someone's home network costs around $2 a month in electricity. It's really just a home computer that's always running. That is a 99.95% reduction in the energy use from Ethereum's proof of work model. That number, 99.95, is a number from a study by a former graduate student at the University of Queensland, Jonas Kleinstauber, who incidentally was an intern at EY this year. A separate study by Carl Beekhausen, a researcher at the Ethereum Foundation, also came up with the same figure. Becoming a staker on the Ethereum network requires a $400 to $2,000 setup, not including your stake. It's a computer. It's the cost of a home computer. A validator on the network today at the current APR generates around $10 a day. On days that it gets chosen to propose a block, it's more like $100 a day. And on days that it gets put on something called a sync committee, it's more like $250 a day. The APR that the Beacon chain pays out is to incentivize people to come stake on the chain. It depends on how many people are on the network. If not enough people are staking, the APR goes up. This is an automatic function, and as of today, the APR has only ever gone down because you can't withdraw your Ether from the chain yet. Withdrawals won't be enabled until after the merge, so every Ether that's ever gone into staking has stayed there since the Beacon chain launched. At 4.5%, this APR is not a get-rich-quick scheme. Crypto is a land where you can see quadruple-digit APRs. Some of those are legit and just really short-lived, and some of those are scams waiting for you to throw your money in so that somebody can run away with it. This is the Wild West of Web3. It's kind of fun to watch, but I'm pretty risk averse, so I stick to staking. It's relatively stable, it's predictable, it's low risk, it's low reward, and there would have to be a catastrophic event in Web3 for your staked Ether to disappear. I got an email from a TradFi investing service last month asking me to open an account because they were raising their APYs to 0.85%. Maybe I'm just a millennial and have been too ingrained in the Web3 community for the last couple of years, and I have the most recent inflation numbers at the forefront of my mind, but 0.85% blows my mind. That is considered a good return in TradFi for people who don't have access to money managers or a crazy amount of cash. 4.5% in Web3 is considered bond level returns. So all of that staked Ether is accruing on the Beacon chain. That's where it's locked up, and that's where rewards are accruing. It is the proof of work, or the proof of stake chain. It shipped on December 1st, 2020, with around 1 million Ether staked in its first week. That was around $400 million at the time, and that was at $400 Ether. Ethereum's proof of stake chain has already been live for a year and a half. Validators on the network have been earning rewards since then. Right now, the Beacon chain on the bottom of this slide runs in parallel to the proof of work chain on the top of this slide. Validators are attesting to and proposing blocks, but they're not actually handling all of the transactions that are happening on the network today. When I send Ether today, it's processed by the proof of work mechanism. You might have heard the term ETH2 early on, and it still sometimes gets used, but it's a deprecated term. There is no ETH2. What's on the Beacon chain right now is known as the consensus layer, and the chain that's processing transactions right now is known as the execution layer. Transactions happening on the network happen on the execution layer. Right now, they're secured by a proof of work mechanism, but when the merge happens, they'll be secured by a proof of stake mechanism. This execution layer in the top chain is getting incorporated in to the Beacon chain, bottom chain. I just want to talk for a second about the amount of R&D and testing and development that's gone into this. Trent Ben Epps, a researcher at the Ethereum Foundation, shared this illustration at the beginning of the month on the progress and timeline of the merge. You can see that several milestones have been achieved. Ethereum's code is public on GitHub. For those of you who don't know what GitHub is, it's a platform and interface for code management. There's a neat merge mainnet readiness checklist that you can look at on the official Ethereum GitHub, and you can see just how much has been done in preparation for this transition and what's left. In addition to all the layer-specific items, there's a bundle of unit tests and integration tests and testnet merges and shadow forks, some of which you can see on this timeline. A shadow fork is where they take a small number of nodes from the network and fork them to basically create a working copy that's still going and has all the same history, but they're not actually publishing to the main chain. This chain is then run through the process as if it's being merged. So it's effectively a representation of what the merge would actually look like. There were 2 mainnet shadow forks in April and 2 in May, and all 4 were hugely successful. They also just successfully merged the Kiln testnet, which was launched as separate proof of work and proof of stake chains, and now fully operates as a proof of stake chain. 3 existing testnets will also be merged in June, July. I know a lot of us like numbers, so I'm going to go through some numbers related to the Beacon chain. Right now, there are 370,000 active validators, each with 32 ETH. That's approximately 12 million ETH staked, or at $3,000 ETH, which I know it's not anymore, $36 billion. With around 120 million Ether in existence and 12 billion of that staked, that means that more than 10% of all Ether is staked. This is all Ether that can't be withdrawn until an upgrade post-merge that enables withdrawals. The supply of Ether has been becoming smaller and smaller since the Beacon chain launched. As a recap, the more Ether that is staked, the lower the staking APR goes. It's meant as an incentive to get people to come secure the chain, and it naturally finds a balance. As the APR decreases, some people will take their Ether post-withdrawals elsewhere in DeFi for higher yields. The market decides what's fair. It's meant to incentivize just enough people to come secure the chain without offering unsustainable rewards. The APR is made up of attestation rewards, which happen every block for every active validator, and proposal rewards, which are sporadic. These 2 rewards together make up that 4.5%. 1,125 new validators can be added per day. So anyone who spins up a validator above that number gets placed into a queue. Last I checked, the queue was around 18,000 validators long, which means that a validator entering the queue today would take about 16 days before they were active and earning rewards. The merge has been a long time coming, and although the timeline has been estimated many times, the date of the merge has always been when it's ready and not before. With how much progress has been made and how many items have been checked off the list, it's now looking like it'll be sometime between August and September, not a guarantee. Another recap, we have a live proof of stake chain that will incorporate the execution layer that's currently being secured by the proof of work chain, and that event is called the merge. What's running on the proof of stake chain right now is and will be the consensus layer, while what's being incorporated with the merge is called the execution layer. The execution layer handles transactions, and the consensus layer takes care of validator protocols. All of this will be secured by the proof of stake chain after the merge, and validators will completely replace miners. So now that we've gone through a lot of the technical aspects, what we really want to know is how is this going to affect Ethereum? One impact that's directly related to stakers is that stakers will see validator rewards increase. This is because miners are currently getting paid in tips and MEV. MEV is a complicated concept that I won't get into. It used to stand for miner extractable value, and now it stands for maximum extractable value, but suffice it to say, right now it's getting paid to miners, but after the merge, it'll get paid to validators. Some folks have estimated that tips and MEV will push APR up to between 6 and 10% right after the merge. I imagine that kind of jump will incentivize more people to come stake, and eventually the APR will find an equilibrium again, but there will be a time after the merge where APR is likely to shoot up. Another new impact is that there will be no new ETH on the market. Right now, miners get paid in ETH and they can immediately turn around and sell that ETH. Withdrawals on the Beacon chain won't be live until the Shanghai upgrade. The Shanghai upgrade will be the next upgrade after the merge. And so there'll be a period of time between the merge and the Shanghai upgrade where the available supply of Ether is doing nothing but decreasing. And every transaction on Ethereum burns a little bit of Ether, meaning that burned Ether just disappears. If this was stocks, it would be like a stock buyback. But right now, every transaction also creates a little bit of Ether that's paid to miners. The net amount is still positive, as in Ether is currently inflationary. After the merge, rewards will no longer cancel out that burned amount, and ETH will flip from being an inflationary asset to being a deflationary asset. Every update on Ethereum is in pursuit of a goal to make Ethereum more sustainable, more scalable, and more secure. It produces less waste to secure the network because people aren't trying to outcompete each other, and they use hardware that's far less resource intensive. It's more scalable because rather than just doing the easy thing and increasing the node size, which would just lead back to an unsustainability problem, proof of stake makes way for a thing called sharding. Shard chains will be in another upgrade after the merge and will provide more layers to store data. Keeping the node size manageable means that more people are able to run more validators, which helps keep the network more secure. With proof of work, all an attacker needs to do is control 51% of the hash rate, and then they can publish anything they want to the chain, and you can't really do anything about it short of breaking into their operation and destroying their computers. With proof of stake, anyone who wants to publish false data to the chain gets their stake taken away and is done attacking the network. If they wanted to keep attacking the chain, it gets really expensive really quickly. Even though this transition has a lot of technical benefits and benefits for stakers, the end user will not see much of a difference. People always ask, will it make Ethereum less expensive to use? The answer is technically no. By itself, the merge has no impact on gas fees. It does, however, make better progress to the implementation of L2s. The Ethereum layer 1, or L1, is the mainnet where gas is expensive. Layer 2s, or L2s, are built on top of Ethereum and inherit Ethereum's robust security, but are way cheaper to transact on. That is where we want end users. In a couple of years, individuals won't be on L1. You've probably heard some of these terms, or you've probably heard some of these about some of these L2s, Arbitrum, Optimism, or rollups like zkSync. That's where people should be, and that's where things will get cheap to use. The merge also isn't meant to increase throughput. Another question that I hear is, what do I have to do with my ETH? Do I have to convert it? The answer is no. Your ETH is your ETH, and the ETH you're holding in your wallet is good to use. You don't have to convert it. You don't have to do anything with it. And I know I already touched on it, but just to reiterate, the merge does not automatically enable withdrawals. That comes later in an update called the Shanghai update. The beacon chain isn't much without its stakers. So let's talk about what staking is, what it looks like, and how to do it. Just to cover some terms real quick, a validator is run on a node. A node can be run without a validator, and that's still helpful to Ethereum, but that doesn't require any ETH, and that doesn't earn you any ETH. A validator is what earns you rewards. An operator is who runs the validator on a node, and a staker is anyone who has ETH staked. A staker isn't necessarily an operator. You can think of a validator as being synonymous with the computer that it's running on. So we'll cover exactly what a validator is and what the different kinds of staking are. Solo staking, pooled staking, staking as a service, all of these in this list fit in there somewhere. You don't need a special computer to run a validator. Anyone can run a validator on a computer with 16 gigabytes of memory and 2 terabytes of storage. To put this into perspective, you can buy a MacBook to fit these requirements. Though most people opt to have a dedicated computer for staking. Using it for only that purpose significantly decreases the risk of having viruses or having it compromised in any way. You need 32 ETH to run a validator, and that's a lot of money to be on the line for most people. So there are best practices to keep that 32 ETH safe. Every validator needs 32 ETH. Every validator needs to be run on hardware somewhere. That hardware needs access to stable internet, reliable electricity, and needs to occasionally be updated or need to do some troubleshooting with it. These requirements can be a lot. I know for a fact that my mom would not be comfortable updating a validator. So what if she had 32 ETH, but isn't comfortable maintaining her own hardware? Or what if she is comfortable maintaining the hardware, but only has 5 ETH? There are options for everyone. We'll cover a smattering of them, but there are too many to go over to cover all of them. Before we go through these options, let's look at exactly what a validator is and what the operator's responsibilities are. A validator mostly just attests to other validators' work. Every once in a while, it's chosen to propose a block. Proposing a block yields higher rewards. Sometimes that block will include information about a dishonest validator, or more likely a validator that duplicated its keys and tried to sign something twice. Being the validator that catches that error, or the whistleblower, also yields higher rewards. The responsibilities of the operator, the person running the validator, are to keep the computer running, keep it online, and keep it updated. The operator isn't combing through transactions. They're not looking at what the validator is attesting to. They're not doing anything manual. He or she just makes sure the software is running, and then the software does all the work. If all of this is running correctly, the validator receives a payment every 6 minutes. The payment is very small if you're just attesting. It's a lot bigger if there's a block proposal or you're on a sync committee. Those two are both pseudo random operations, and you can't influence when they happen. If you take your validator offline, say you're performing updates, you get a micro penalty every 6 minutes. If you would have earned, say, 10 cents, your validator will be deducted 10 cents instead. You only lose the equivalent of what you would have earned if you had been online. Penalties are not the same thing as slashing. Penalties happen all the time. Someone's power goes out, or their computer has some sort of issue and freezes, or Comcast just sucks that day. If it's a coordinated attack, the penalty will be high. Slashing is a serious event. Slashing happens when the network detects that your validator submitted false information. Validators submitting incorrect data is a serious threat to the integrity of a blockchain, and it's treated as such. The slashing fee that gets deducted from your validator can be anywhere from 1 to 32 ETH. It's dependent on how many other validators were slashed at the same time. Like I said, if it's coordinated, the penalty will be very high. If it's a lone validator, it'll be assumed that it was a mistake and the penalty will be small. Whatever the fee, a portion of that is paid to the whistleblower and the validator that found the incorrect data. The slashed validator is involuntarily exited from the network, and the operator of that slashed validator has to wait a period of time before they can claim the rest of their ETH. How do you get slashed? You run 2 instances of your validator at once, or you edit the code of your validator to intentionally submit incorrect data. The first and best option for staking is solo staking. With solo staking, you have your computer on your home network and you alone control the validator. You have 32 ETH on that validator, and it's collecting rewards and then distributing them directly to you. You have a seed phrase, and no one in the world except for you has ever seen it. Solo staking is simply an agreement between you and the beacon chain. Your risks are pretty much limited to a bug in Ethereum. The security of your stake isn't dependent on anyone but you and the Ethereum network. It's non-custodial because no one holds your keys except for you. It's trustless because you don't have to trust any person not to lose your ether. This is the gold standard of staking. Right now, it's what's recommended if possible. There are some caveats here. Right now, staking on Ethereum is young. It's not the easiest process in the world, though there are some killer guides out there that will walk you through it literally step by step. Somer ESAT and CoinCashew both have some highly recommended guides. At the moment, it still requires interaction with a command line interface, which I know understandably intimidates some people, but there are some things that exist and some more in development that makes this feel less like hacking and more like a user-friendly deposit. So if you're not comfortable using a command line interface, DAppNode is a plug-and-play solution. It's a free and open source platform for deploying and hosting decentralized apps, peer-to-peer clients, and blockchain nodes. You can use it to run a solo staking node without having to use command line. You can run this on your own hardware, or DAppNode also sells hardware, so you can buy their computers with the software pre-installed. Then you go through a pretty simple process to set up a validator. Ethereum is also an option that helps streamline setting up a validator. It's free and open source and helps you set up your node with a user interface. Avado is another option, and they're a lot like DAppNode, but they're a little more expensive and they're not open source. And I will always advocate for open source over closed source, especially when you're putting your Ether at stake. It's personally important for me for it to be publicly auditable and aligned with the values of the Ethereum ecosystem, but it is a valid option. In addition to the risk of a bug in Ethereum, these options have an added risk of a bug in the software. This risk can be mitigated by using software that's audited and established. Again, I think open source is an important feature here. What about the very common scenario of wanting to stake but not having 32 ETH? There are lots of options rapidly developing because of the amount of demand there are for these options. Every validator still needs 32 Ether, so the solution here is something called pooled staking. Basically, someone or something collects a bunch of different people's Ether, gives them a receipt for it, pools it together to make parcels of 32 ETH to run validators. When you're looking at these options, you have to keep in mind some considerations. Unlike solo staking, you have the option to be liquid with pooled staking. There are some services that will give you a token in exchange for your Ether and provide with the promise that it can always be traded back. The benefit of that is that then you can take that token and then go provide liquidity or trade or do whatever degen DeFi stuff that people do to earn double or triple digit APRs. Or you can exit your staking position. Another consideration you should look at is exactly who holds your keys. There are options where your keys are in a smart contract. You provide the Ether and your keys are held by that smart contract that will disperse the funds back to you when certain conditions are met. This is the case for the first two of these options. There's a subtle difference though in who controls these smart contracts. With Rocket Pool, the network controls the smart contract and it is therefore non-custodial. Some other options use smart contracts and are controlled by a multi-sig or a DAO. So while your Ether is still in a smart contract, these options are considered semi-custodial. Then on the end of the spectrum, there are fully custodial staking solutions. Two examples are the centralized exchanges Coinbase and Kraken. They'll stake your Ether for you and give you a receipt. These particular two don't offer a liquidity token, but some centralized exchanges like Binance do. Binance is not an option I'd recommend, by the way. These options take a portion of your rewards. There are a lot more options and you can look at all of them on this website, which will also be on my last slide. Another situation I want to cover is, what if I have 32 ETH and I want to be closer to solo staking, but I'm just not comfortable maintaining my own hardware? Two options for this are blocks and all nodes. They'll basically facilitate you solo staking, but maintain the hardware themselves, and in most cases, charge you a monthly fee. In this case, blocks is fully non-custodial because they don't have to have access to your key. They run your validator with a remote signer on AWS. The risk here is if AWS goes down, they can no longer sign for you, and all of the validators go down. That's particularly risky because say AWS goes down one day, every validator on blocks goes down, and the penalty is higher if a lot of validators are offline at the same time. It's not a perfect solution. All nodes, like blocks, runs a validator for you. They actually do have your validator key, but so do you. So that's considered semi-custodial. Again, not a perfect solution, but a valid one. There's one special condition I want to cover with Rocket Pool. If you have 16 ETH, you can essentially solo stake with Rocket Pool. This is a novel solution where you take your 16 ETH, you throw it down, and Rocket Pool pulls together 16 ETH from small stakers who threw in small amounts. They call that a mini pool. Your 16 ETH and the other 16 ETH get combined together to make a 32 ETH validator, and the mini pool operator runs the validator at their home or wherever. This is done by a smart contract. When withdrawing from the beacon chain, that operator only has access to their portion of the rewards. They can't run off with the rest of it. But as a reward for operating that validator, they get a 15% commission from the half that doesn't belong to them. So 15% of the interest paid on that 16 ETH that was paired with their 16 ETH. A mini pool operator with 32 ETH can actually make more running 2 Rocket Pool valid mini pools than a solo staker can. This is a very cool solution. And while there is extra risk because you're running a smart contract, or because you're using a smart contract, and there's always a risk in adding a layer between you and the beacon chain, this risk is made smaller by numerous audits on that contract. Like I said, the best option is always to solo stake. There have been around 170 slashings since the beacon chain launched. 105 of these were 2 custodial staking services who accidentally duplicated their keys to their validators. Around 60 of those were home stakers. In most, if not all cases of home stakers getting slashed, it's because they duplicated their validator keys. This can be done if you buy a new computer and you start up your validator on the new computer before you shut down the old one. Or probably more commonly, if you're chasing 100% uptime on your validator and you create a second instance of your validator that's only supposed to run if the first one goes down, but you don't set it up right or something goes wrong and they both try to sign something at the same time. That's 170 slashings out of 370,000 active validators, with the majority of that 170 being 2 individual events where custodial staking solutions screwed up. So you can get slashed for duplicating your validator or for submitting incorrect data. To submit incorrect data, you'd have to actually get into the validator code and manually edit it to submit false data. To even attempt this, you'd have to be really, really tech savvy. If you follow a guide and you don't try to get clever and chase 100% uptime, you're not going to get slashed. Just in case I haven't said it enough, solo staking is the best way to stake. Solo staking is the option that is healthiest for the Ethereum network. Not everybody can do it, and there are options if you don't have the capital, the hardware, or the willingness to follow a guide. But there are options that are better than others, and you should choose the ones that give you the most control over your own capital and the ones that are healthiest for the Ethereum network. Yeah. One of the biggest factors in measuring the health of the Ethereum network is decentralization. Why should you care if Ethereum is decentralized? Because your investment is in ETH. And Ethereum is the most robust when it's decentralized. If you choose options that contribute to the centralization of the network, you're basically undermining your own investment. And at that point, why are you investing in Ethereum? I invest in Ethereum because I believe in its capacity to lead to a more fair economy, to more transparency, to fewer middlemen, to less invasive software, and to more sustainable and efficient ways of interacting and collaborating with each other. If we don't focus on the health of the network early on, monopolization is a compounding problem. Power leads to more power, and an early effort to make sure that Ethereum's ecosystem is robust and decentralized and scalable will make the difference in whether or not this technology can have the impact that it has the potential to have. After all, if you let Ethereum become centralized, all it is a really slow database. We already have databases. We don't need to reinvent them on the blockchain. We especially don't need to reinvent a worse version. Decentralization is the entire point. That being said, there are a lot of avenues toward centralization that we have to look out for. With validators being what secure the network, they are the heart of Ethereum. So if we let any one operator control too much of the network, we've stopped the ability of blood to circulate to the rest of the system. Or we've at least given someone the opportunity to stop that circulation if they feel like it. The next point of centralization is the software client that runs a validator. If everybody runs the same same software client to run their validator and there's a bug in an update, then all of validators could go offline at the same time. There are currently 5 software clients, and there has been a tremendous effort in the last few months to make sure no one client has a supermajority. Earlier this year, 70% of the network, of validators on the network were using the most popular client. There was a rally by the community to educate node operators about the danger of too many operators being on the same client. And within just a couple of months, that client's dominance was below 50%. And I think I actually looked this morning, and it was at 40%. Another point is hardware. We don't want every node operator using the same hardware. Again, if there's a bug, they could all go down. So we want people running on a range of operating systems and brands and chips. We also don't want everyone running on AWS or the same cloud service. Lastly, we don't want validators to be subject to any one country's policies. Ethereum will be the most secure with validators running all across the globe. This website is a pretty good tool for measuring Ethereum's decentralization. Ethereum is young. We need to get it set up on the right footing. People will always see technology with a lot of potential and want to have power over it. But getting Ethereum nodes set up while hitting all these points of decentralization means that we build a network that can't be captured by any one entity. This is the goal, and it's important to get it right to begin with. It's difficult, or I might say impossible, to decentralize something that starts out centralized. These are some resources that you can look at for more information on staking. And in case I can't answer all or any of the questions that I get, this is my email, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that I get by email.
Thanks a lot, Nix. That was really informative. Next one. Questions.
How does proof of work solve the monopoly issue where the largest ETH holders proof of stake implementation would have a higher chance of being block validators and thus increase ETH holdings? So it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a higher chance, because they have the same chance as everybody else. So that's the beauty of proof of stake, is that everybody has the same chance. It's not like proof of work where if you have a higher amount, you have a higher chance. Everybody has the same rate. So if I stake 0.1 ETH, I get 5% APR, and that's taking into account how random these proposals are. Or if I have 500 ETH staked, it's the same thing. I still have a 5% APR. What about the risk of a whale trade to put down a blockchain proof of stake? So that's another thing. If somebody, so I don't know about like the trading mechanisms and like what happened with like Terra and that, but I can tell you that like a whale couldn't take a gigantic amount of Ethereum, and they could attack the network, but their stake would immediately be taken away, because unlike proof of work, you can actually identify the validator that is attacking the network, whereas proof of work, you can't identify the miner that's doing that. So it would be really expensive to attack the network. I don't know about trading. If that's the question, then you'll have to ask somebody who's more adept at like the economics of trading. Many in the crypto world believe that conversion to proof of stake will never happen due to the underlying infrastructure of Ethereum. Is there any chance that the merge never happens in your opinion? Why do you believe it will be successful at some point? Thanks. This is definitely something, this is a narrative that's propagating a lot. Like the merge will never happen because it's been delayed so many times and people are losing faith that it'll ever happen. But I honestly think that those people aren't paying attention to how much progress has been made and how many testnet merges and shadow forks have been done. Like it's an incredible amount of work, and it's an incredible amount of progress that they've made, and they are really, really close to the merge. So yes, I do think it'll happen, and no, in my opinion, I don't think there's any chance that it won't happen. There could be a bug that happens, something could go wrong. It's not very likely at this point. All right, what's the next question?
What if all the biggest mining proof of work miners switch to proof of stake? What would it mean to the principle of decentralization?
We would love that. If the proof of work miners switch to proof of stake, that would be great. It would be great for the network. And the beauty of proof of stake is that your the validator incentive, they're aligned with the Ethereum ecosystem. Proof of work, a lot of miners end up selling their ETH, and proof of stake, the more ETH you have staked, the more that you're going to make. Proof of work, you don't have to own any ETH to make more. You just have hardware. You're investing in hardware, not in Ethereum.
When is the merge expected to occur?
My guess is late August, early September, but that could be delayed depending. I really think that it's a lot more likely at this point to be August, September. But again, don't quote me. There's never been a date set for the merge. It's always been an estimated time.
What will happen to ERC20 coins as a result of the merge with the consensus layer?
Stay exactly the same.
How does proof of stake solve the trend towards monopoly or centralization, i.e. accumulation of ETH versus processing power for proof of work?
I feel like I already did address that question, but if you have any more question that I didn't address, feel free to email it to me.
If the returns of ETH staking are not that high, what is the motivation for anyone to be a validator?
Safe rewards. 4.5% is a pretty good return for me. If you think that you can make better rewards, if you think you can make 10, 12, 15% doing something else, go do that. 20% was just promised on stable coins on another ecosystem, and that blew up. And I like the safety of the Ethereum ecosystem, and I like the safety of staking while also being able to support the network. I'm really excited about the potential of Ethereum, and I'm really excited to support it. And 4.5% is good for me. And if people decide that that's not enough, they can take their Ether and they can go earn rewards elsewhere. The APR will go up and more people will come. We don't want to offer unsustainable rewards and get a ton of people, because we don't want, we just want the right amount of people validating to secure the network.
Is it possible for a validator to be authorized to switch off without incurring into penalties?
You can exit your validator, yes. You can switch it off and you won't incur penalties. Basically, you'll have to wait a period of time. You'll be in an exit queue. But right now you can't withdraw it. But after the merge, or after the withdrawals are enabled, basically you'll exit your validator and then you'll be able to take it offline without incurring penalties.
I think you already answered this. Do you think by Q3 2022, the consensus layer will merge with execution layer?
I think at least by Q4.
Right. Could these penalties add up, say, in the case of a power outage? What has your experience been?
So I personally run a validator, and yeah, so if you're offline for 2 weeks, you would lose 2 weeks worth of rewards and also get those 2 weeks taken away. So for every 10 cents I would have earned, I get 10 cents taken away. So it would take 4 weeks to make up that 2 weeks offline. I personally don't worry about it. My validator went offline last night while I was meeting with some people, and I decided I would deal with it when I got home or when I got back to my hotel. It's not a big deal. I think you can be offline for like something like 10 years before you actually get exited. You have to have like a 50% offline rate to be exited from the network. So it's really not a big deal if you're offline. Lots of people like to keep their uptime as high as possible, but it's not a high stress thing.
What will happen to Beacon Chain after merging?
The Beacon Chain will continue as it goes, and the execution layer will be merged into the Beacon Chain.
Right. A few more questions. 32 ETH minimum aside to generate a return, how comparable is doing a crowd loan in a Polkadot auction to staking?
I cannot answer that question. I don't know anything about Polkadot. I'm sorry.
In proof of stake, can one entity still gain more than 50% of the stake?
Yeah, we have to be really careful of that. So an operator could potentially control more than 50% of the stake. They could control a majority of the network. So we need to make sure that the operators are decentralized. And one thing I really like about home staking, solo staking, and Rocket Pool, for example, is that you have all of the different validators are running it in their homes. You cannot have one entity control all these home validators and coordinate some sort of attack with them because they're distributed all over.
Would the merge result in any downtime with the chain?
No, I'm pretty sure the answer to that is no. I'd have to look more into that, but like Ethereum doesn't have downtime. That's not a thing.
Is 4.5% APR the minimum that proof of stake will provide?
No, it's not the minimum. I don't remember if there's actually a minimum, but if there is, it's like 3 to 4% or something. Again, you can email me that question. I'm happy to look more into that.
Last of the tough questions. Why would you not trust or recommend Binance?
So Binance is associated with the Binance chain, which is a different chain, and that's inherently at odds with Ethereum because they're competitive. They're a competitor to Ethereum, and so they're just not aligned with Ethereum's values and the success of Ethereum.
I think the first one you already answered. I think those are the end of the questions. Great questions. Thanks for all the answers.
Yeah.
It was a really great session.
I'm glad to have been able to talk at this conference, and I'm really excited to hear the rest of it.
Thanks everyone for continuing the session. Today I'll pass it on to Arvin to introduce IIR and continuing on the session on digital asset custody. Over to you, Arvin.
Thanks a lot, Karthik. Pleasure to be here with you all. Aaron Holmes, I'm our Global Blockchain CTO, and today I'm really excited to be introducing another special speaker for us. He's a recent joiner to EY. He's spent the past 18 years working at 3 different GSIBs. So what's a GSIB? You might ask. It's a globally systemically important bank, so pretty large financial organizations. And over those 18 years, he's been leading both operational risk and information security systems. He holds a PhD in cryptography, where he initiated the development of threshold cryptography, the MPC or multi-party compute approach that is used by many digital custodians. As folks that are entering into the digital asset space, this is a really foundational capability that anybody who wants to enter into the space needs to establish custody. And really excited for you today to be pulling back the onion and sharing a little bit behind the scenes, like what is the art and science behind digital asset custody. So with that, here, over to you.
Thank you, Arwen. As Arwen mentioned, we'll be talking about digital asset custody. So this is the masterclass entitled The Art and a Little Science of Digital Asset Custody. What we're going to talk about is the aspects of being a custodian, whether you are looking at it in the context of providing custody services to your clients, where you're looking at a custody for your own use, where you have internal clients, and also when you want to think about it in that you're not going to self-custody, but you are looking at another custodian and want to think about what does a custodian do? What are the kinds of things I may want to perform when I assess a custodian? And when we think about custody, it becomes a question that becomes very vital as soon as you are incorporating that technology into your place. All right. So when you think about digital custody, you want to think about a bunch of intertwining set of requirements. There are requirements around regulations. There are requirements around interoperability, scalability, robustness, which kind of blockchains you want to use, and where you want to integrate solutions with. And the best way of thinking about it is one in which we break it down into a very simplistic framework, one where we can think about consumable pieces, and those consumable pieces are easier to think about and break down. So for this conversation, we'll break it into 4 pieces. One is oversight. Oversight is the aspect of looking at the acceptable bounds that you want, both from your client's perspective, from the custodian's perspective, as well as potentially others, including things like the government. And the things you're thinking about is like, how do I manage my risk, and what are my requirements, and what are all the aspects that I want to oversee prior to the point in time that the actual transaction would happen and be sent over to safekeeping. Safekeeping is the next component of the framework. We think about that as the part that is not only holding keys and the cryptographic keys and managing assets, but also managing the transactions. Because to manage your assets and to safekeep your assets, you need to be part of the whole full transaction. So the safekeeping is a component that monitors all the way down to settlement, and is a very important part in doing account management. It's very important and essential in signing transaction to be submitted to the blockchain, as well as monitoring any kind of transactions that may have happened. Then there's utility, and utility is a bunch of reusable services. When we think about designing these systems, you may want to eventually get to different blockchains and different asset classes that you may want to custody. And therefore, with utility, we want to create reusable components that the oversight and the safekeeping can reach out into and use them over and over again. Now, these become foundational. The oversight, the safekeeping, the utility are very foundational in a custody. But we built custody to build opportunities. And some of those opportunities are around creating active and passive investments for your clients, for instance. And there are other aspects that you can start building upon that, like you want to provide lending, you want to do portfolio analytics. All of these can be brought into an opportunity that you bundle up with your custody framework. We'll talk a little bit more around that towards the end of the presentation. So let's talk before we go into the more specific, what is a wallet? Because a wallet and a custody is very similar. In a very simplistic way, a wallet gives you an interface to be able to manage your interaction with the blockchain and your currencies. It provides a safeguarding in a very similar way that safekeeping is provided within a custodian. And a personal wallet may be more simplistic, and it may not have all the regulations and requirements around it, but it does have a safekeeping piece to it. And similar to a wallet, there's a mechanism that you need to interact with the blockchain. So if we think about it and compare, let's say, an institutional wallet with that of a personal wallet, they're very much the same. However, one is more institutionalized. There's oversight to deal with things like regulations. There's oversight to manage the assets and potentially to do a higher level of safekeeping in case of disaster recovery, business continuity. But the two are very, very similar. So what we'll do in the rest of the talk is we'll go through the framework, talk about some of the requirements and some of the areas one should be thinking about. As we start and think about a framework, we should also think about it in the context of where you're going as well. So that wallet is going to create you an offering and a connectivity that becomes foundational. And that's why we think about it in the framework, is if we build that framework correct, we then give us a way to integrate into coins and to support other payments and build other types of products. And as we drive that, our discussion around the framework, we give ourselves the opportunity to be thinking about a future roadmap. And one should think about that roadmap early on. Even though we can't guess the future, we can guess more or less where we're going and the kind of capabilities that we would want to go as we mature. And as the regulatory requirements also becomes more clarified. So let's talk about oversight. Mentioned earlier, this is where we look at the bounds and the restrictions that we want to set up. And we think about it from two sides. One is around the client's authorization. So the person that's making a request to transact or setting up an account. And we want to give them an ability to authorize transactions and manage their account, manage their interface into the custody service. The second one is the custodian. The custodian themselves has a bunch of controls that they want to be able to integrate as part of the solution. Some of it may be around regulations, like travel rules and such, sanctions and such. There may be some risk management controls. They may say certain accounts can only have a certain amount, or certain amounts can transact to a certain level, or I will have a wallet that can only hold a certain maximum value. And there may be also additional policies like how many people need to authorize a certain level of a transaction, either internal or for the client. So these are the types of oversight that one needs to think about. And when we think about it, we look at it in the context of a workflow. So client comes in, there's a bunch of potential workflows before it ever gets to a point in time where we're doing a transaction signing. We're looking at records, we're doing compliance checks, we're doing risk checks. And all of this needs to be taken from what the client made a request either from an API or from a web interface and convert it to a format that the blockchain will be able to understand. So clients send something very simplistic, but eventually this has to be formatted in a manner that the blockchain will understand, and that format will be eventually signed. Now, one of the things that we want to think about is how these approvals are going through. So one aspect is around implicit approvals. Implicit means as we work through the process accepts the prior processes and says it all happened okay previously. So there isn't an explicit way of knowing that such a person actually approved it. I just know that I'm at this point in my workflow, and they're at this point in my workflow. If it's gotten to me, I can go back to the next step. There can also be a more explicit one. One way of thinking about it is that you digitally sign your approvals, and that digital signature, your approval signature, flows all the way through, all the way to the point that that is being signed. Explicit ensures that there wasn't any kind of adversarial or other bad performance that may have happened somewhere in the workflow, and therefore has a greater level of security controls, but adds extra complexity into the process. The other thing you want to think about is what is being validated. During the process, you may look at metadata. The client asks for moving 1 Bitcoin, where the raw transaction will actually show you the UTXOs and be much more explicit. And the two don't necessarily have to align, especially if something goes wrong. And therefore, when you're thinking about oversight, you should also be thinking about what is the type of data and at what point in time the actual transaction that will be submitted is actually being used to perform your oversight function. Let's talk a little bit about safekeeping. And this is the area that we generally think around custody. Safekeeping is the aspect where we're thinking around key management, which is the area where we're protecting the keys, we're storing our keys, we're mapping our keys to actual accounts if there are multiple accounts. And it's the focus point around where we oftentimes think about a wallet and a custodian, because we're thinking about safekeeping as the one of the core aspects of it. It's also the place where we're doing digitally signing. So when you submit transactions to the blockchain, it's not like a personal wallet. You actually have to take a transaction, you have to format it, and then you have to sign it with the keys that are associated with the assets that are on the blockchain. We talked about approval validation. We talked about oversight previously, but eventually that oversight process will get to the point and time of safekeeping, and we need to validate at that point in time, have all the approvals. Am I accepting to perform the transaction that I need to do on the wallet, which will eventually get to the into the blockchain. There's bookkeeping and records, because you need to monitor where your transactions are, and you want to do independent analysis, and there's a value add. Now, I marked in with a little I some areas that we'll go into a little bit more in depth, but I wanted to kind of skim over some of those after I put an introduction around each of the components. So around key management, one of the first things that people talk about is around, do I make a single point of a control or distributed trust? So you may hear terms like multi-signatures or MPC. Multi-signature MPC make it so there isn't a single point of abuse, meaning there isn't a single place where my key is held. And if I get into that single spot, then I may be able to abuse the system. With multi-party and multi-signatures, I've distributed the trust such that you have to break into multiple places to be able to compromise a system. And these are a common way of custody solutions. And we'll talk a bit more around details. Another aspect around key management is the type of the way that I store my keys. And there are multiple methodologies, and we'll discuss that. One way is to make lots of keys and protect those keys. Another way is to have a single set part of randomness. We'll talk in more detail, and we'll be able to derive all the other keys. So we don't store lots of keys, and realize in some wallets, these could be hundreds of thousands of keys. We don't store all those keys. What we do is we store something small, and we derive everything else. Another aspect that's important to think around is around the types and the number of wallets. Are you going to have cold wallets? Do you have hot wallets? Do you have different business areas, and those different business areas or different offerings require you to have different wallets? If you're holding the same wallet and you're using keys for your smart contracts to administer them, and you may want to put those keys in a separate control than the ones that are holding custody of cryptographic assets. So you want to think about the structure rather than throw it all into one. There may be regulatory, there may be liability control mechanisms that you can place by having more than one wallet. And you got to think about how to protect shards. So eventually these shards and the keys need to function. So they need to be protected at the point in time that they're actually being used, not only at the point in time that they're being stored. Talk a little bit around books and records. One of the areas that you think about, and again, we're talking about multiple ways that one can do a custody solution. One, you may purchase a vendor, you may build it yourself, you may use a third party. But it's important to make sure that the information that in the wallet aligns with the information that sits on the blockchain. So it's great to have independent validation. So you run separate processes that says, okay, these are all my accounts. My wallet is telling me one thing, but I want a set of books and records that gives me another source of truth to validate that what I'm seeing in my wallet aligns to my validation around what is on the blockchain. And we want to think about it around reconciliation across the full life cycles and where different parts of the transaction flows that these are coming from. So one of the first things you want to think about in a wallet, in a custodying of assets, is how do you hold your keys? The typical way we think about in cryptography is basically what is shown on the right. We generate random keys over time, and those keys get encrypted with a key encrypting key. And we tend to use a system called a HSM, a hardware security module. And some people are using some other technologies as well. But what we do is we protect the key encrypting key, and all the other keys we encrypt and we store. Now, we don't have to protect those keys from privacy because the key encrypting key is held in a secure fashion. But all the other keys have to be available to you. So if you lose them, a drive goes down or whatever, right? If you don't have them backed up, then you won't be able to transact your transaction. So all those keys, though they are encrypted, they still need to be available to you, and you have to make sure that you properly back them up. Another approach that's commonly used, and this is often used also in personal wallets, is HD wallet. Best way to think about HD wallet is actually talk about what the H and the D stands for. The D represents that given some input, and it's a random input, it could come from a QR code, it could be a passphrase you write. And we'll also talk about shards in a little while. This is a way of splitting it, but it's a set of inputs. And you can use that to derive all your other keys. And from then having a small set of information, you derive everything else. What's different here is you derive them at the point in time that you need them. So you don't store the derived keys, you don't protect the derived keys, you protect only the input. The H part of HD wallet is hierarchical. It creates a structure so that that structure can define different coin types. It can define different accounts. And instead of creating in your storage around, a folder system and having, all your keys all over the place and having to maintain that, an HD wallet does that automatically. And the derivation, you can say, I want this account for this type of cryptocurrency, and it will give you the address that you need or the key that's needed. The two are commonly used in both in the industry, and they both have their advantages and disadvantages. They're both secure. They both have different value adds in how you manage it and how you protect it, and what can happen during a compromise should you have one. I do want to make one point around shards, is that shards, which we'll talk about in a second, are a way of splitting up keys. When we do provide shards and we're using an HD wallet, we continue to have shards. So people will oftentimes say, I take a key and I'll split it into shards. That's not what generally happens. We don't take keys and split. We generally start with shards and we end with shards, and we never bring shards together. So when we're using an HD wallet, even in that case, we'll start with shards, we'll run a distributed process, and we'll end up with shards in the end. So let's talk a little bit about different ways that signing is happening when we're doing safekeeping. Now, the difference between a personal wallet, and a physical wallet, where you have in your pocket or in your purse, is you open it up, you look inside it, and the assets are actually sitting right in the wallet. If something was stolen, you would actually know just by looking at your wallet. In a digital wallet, you don't actually have your assets sitting in your wallet, you actually have keys. And those keys are associated with assets that sit on the blockchain. So you use your keys to transact. In a physical wallet, when I provide someone $1, they care about the authenticity during that transfer of the dollar or the euro or the pound. They don't generally care about me and who I am. But in digital assets, the wallet is identifying me, saying, am I the person that has access to those assets associated with that address? And that address is like a public key. So holding the key and protecting that key is very important. So when we think about transacting on a blockchain, what we do is we take a raw transaction. That's a transaction that represents the actions that I'm asking. It tells the from address, the to address, the amounts, it may have UTXOs. And that raw transaction then needs to be signed. So in the top method, as you'll see, it's a kind of a very standard approach. We have a raw transaction, we have a single key. Before we take and sign something with that key, we validate, as we said, around oversight. Some process will happen at that point in time. And then we sign it, and that then becomes submitted to the blockchain. Now, the challenge with that approach is that if you break any part of that, any single piece, either at, let's say you steal the key, or you break into the approval process and just allow unauthorized transactions to be able to be signed, then you have the challenge of, what do? Well, you try to move your assets if the other person hasn't moved them before you have, right? So that type of mechanism, though it can be made very secure with HSMs, is still have this weakness of around a single point of abuse. So if one thinks about one key is secure, two keys are obviously even more secure, and they are, right? And the advantage around a multi-signature is now we can say, I require two. Now, we can do a policy that says 2 out of 3 or 2 out of 5, so it's not limited to 2. You can give a whole set of, like, these are all the possible addresses or keys that are necessary to be signed with. Now, in this case, we can ask the same question, which is, what happens if there's a compromise? And let's say they compromise only one of the boxes, right? So one of the keys. In that case, you're still safe, right? Because if they got one of the keys, then the other key still gives you a level of protection that aligns to the first case that we talked about, which is a single key, because you're now down to one key as protecting you. And you are now still protected. However, if you want to go and change and go back to a multi-signature, you need to go to the blockchain and inform it and make changes on the blockchain that represent that I'm now using a new key, and I need to remove the old key from that. So that may require multiple transactions in the blockchain. It may take time, and it will certainly have a potential cost implication. Multi-signatures are very good, and they certainly should be used, and there's a lot of advantages. They are not always available for all asset types, though. And it's one of the areas that when you look at it and you look at your solutions, you need to think about whether it's available and what you're trying to do. Then there is multi-party computation. We talked a little bit earlier about multi-party computation. In a multi-party solution, what's happening is you have shards rather than keys in each of those areas. And again, this can also have redundancy. So you can have like a 2 out of 5 or a 3 out of 5. I'm showing 3 here. In a multi-party computation, you start with a raw transaction just like in the beginning of the first one, and you provide that to each of the shard holders. Now, each of the shard holders will then perform a computation and send it to a combining function. That combining function does not need to be a trusted function. It just needs to be available. So if it's been broken into, will not cause any security compromise. That function will take these results that come out from each of the shard holders and generate the signature, just as if it's a single signature. In fact, you can distinguish it from a single signature. And then that gets submitted to the blockchain. Now, there's a lot of advantages that you also get with MPC. But let's take the examples we talked about. What happens should there be a compromise? In the context of MPC, if there is a compromise of less than a quorum, so let's say the requirement is to have 3. So if 2 of them were compromised, similar to a multi-signature, you have not been compromised. But unlike a multi-signature, there is the ability to repair and come back to all 3 shards and being able to have the same level of security. In this case, the key and your addresses don't get changed. So MPC gives us that level of advantage in being able to implement our controls. So one of the things we want to think around MPC is around whether it is MPC and multi-signature is that it adds diversity. So we oftentimes think about this is about making more keys and splitting keys, but actually MPC and multi-signatures give us something even more. They allow us to add diversity to our infrastructure. And this is something we should think about when you put it. So think about it, it's in the sense that what I can do is I can actually take each of those components and I can put them, for instance, in different operating system. Let's say Windows or in an iOS, and let's say Unix, right? And I have a critical Windows vulnerability. In that case, what ends up happening, we will potentially have an insecurity on the systems that have Windows vulnerability, but the other ones are safe. They're not vulnerable. I can fix up the Windows vulnerability, and I can reshard, which we'll talk about in a second. And I can add this diversity in multiple dimensions. I can have different administrative teams. So you don't have a single team that's doing patching and updates of your software. And if individual is compromised, you have an insider attack, you can actually have different people managing your software under these different assets and having a greater level of control than you would if you had all being operated by one single team. Now notice you don't have to, like if you have a system that has, let's say, 3 components in it, as this one is shown here, it's okay to split up in 2 ways. So you may have 3 operating systems, or you may have 2 operating systems that are used. You still get a higher level of protection. You can also think about this in hosting as another level of diversity to think about. For instance, you could have something in, one cloud provider like Azure, and a second cloud provider, AWS, and you may have something on-prem or even a third cloud provider. What this does is it reduces the potential of your getting an attack surface that can cause havoc in all 3 areas. I also showed about the enforcement engine where that check mark is shown, right? You can also put diversity there. You can have different teams running those. So like someone can't compromise and change a policy and such. Those are all areas that are prime for areas of controls that are possibility to add diversity. So when you're looking at multi-signatures, you're looking at MPC, don't just stop the conversation with, hey, I split my keys. Really look at this aspect around diversity. I talked a little bit about, how do you repair yourself should you have a compromise? And it's a concept called proactive security, which some solutions do have a mechanism that is available. In an MPC solution, what ends up happening is you have shards. And without going too much math, let's say the shards are these squares that we show to the left, and one of them compromised. In this case, we actually, if we show 3 of them, 2 of them could be compromised. And those are just numbers. And when you add those numbers, if you look on the right, you add those numbers, the squares, you come up to the key. You don't need to bring the key together to sign, but they do sum up to being the key. And what you want to do is convert those shards, the square ones, to round ones, which are random, but become the same key, right? So, and you want to do that such that even if a bad person who'd been compromised, even when they're part of that process, that I can fix that entity, let's say the one with the square, I repair him, I fix the vulnerability, I take the bad guy out. He knows that key, I still need that key because it's part of the shard that I need to know. Fix it, generate new shards, and delete the old shards. And therefore, I'm back to having a requirement of 3. The way this is done is a bit interesting in that each of those groups, the dark gray one, for instance, will generate a bunch of random numbers that add up to 0. And it will distribute it to itself and to the other 2 parties. The light gray one does the same, takes a bunch of numbers, add them up to 0, such that they add up to 0 and distribute it to itself and to the other 2 parties. And the yellow one does it as well. Notice what's happening in the middle. That's equal to 0, but it's a random number. Now, we'll take one example being the dark shard going across, right? It's using a random number from itself. It's using a random number from the light and as well as the yellow, and it's generating a new circle. And that circle is a random number. Why? Because it's taken random numbers from the 2 other parties that it had. And that is happening across each of those rows. So what we're having is, if you look at it, you're looking at it and saying, hey, I started out with a key. I took a bunch of numbers. They were all random, but in the end of the day, they're all add up to 0. So if I take all the circles, then I will add up to the same key because I just took the key plus 0 and got back to the key. And the advantage here is now I have a set of new shards that I didn't need to change my addresses nor my public keys. I was able to maintain against a compromise. And that has its advantages. There's some other things that can be done here. You can now create and add new players. So let's say you want to go from a 3 out of 5 to a 4 out of 5. You can use a very similar technique. You can bring in other players into this, and you can change your structures using similar mechanisms as is presented on this slide. We won't go into those complexities, but this is one of the advantages of doing something with MPC. So we talked a little bit as the other part of the framework is around utility. So oversight and the safekeeping need to access the blockchain potentially, or it may need even to access other third-party components. So one of the most important one is accessing the blockchain. You need to know your UTXOs if you're using Bitcoin. You need to know your addresses. You need to know how much you have, for instance, around reconciliation. All of those are important parts. And you need to think about how you're going to get access to that. Do I run my own nodes? Am I hosting it? What's the capacity that I want? Where do I need these nodes? Do I want them all over the world? Do I need them in only one location? Each of these has its own little interesting things. And then, also, do I have my own smart contracts? Do I have to administer those smart contracts? How do I provision contracts, right? And such, where I'm maintaining keys. So all of those are aspects that, as an organization, you may need to provide for yourself, or you may need to host, but at some point in time, you have to think about, if I have running a custodial services, I need to connect to the blockchain, and I need to be able to perform the services that I need. You also need to think about third-party services and the connectivity to those, right? And you'll use those for different reasons depending on what your business is and what your requirements are. But you may need them for compliance. You may need them for regulatory requirements and such. You may need them also, to monitor the blockchain for things outside of just your assets, like, any kind of activity that's happening around the blockchain that you want to know, like forks, as an example. They give you a lot of ability around looking at assets, activities, changes that are happening, what is the current fees. All of that is an area you may use a third party, or you may perform your own calculations on your own. And to provide value-added services that may also be interesting. So you may want to do market data, you may want to white label or private label certain services as well. And then you think about this in a lot of supporting services that you may also consider in the type of business that you're in. You need to know what network fee calculation, do some kind of network fee calculation, right? So if you want to go on to transact, there are fees that are going to be paid, either fees to the smart contract, fees to the network. Those all have to be integrated. You need to be able to provide, any kind of activity and any kind of balances that are performed and such. As with all good engineering and design, we think about reusability and segregation of our systems. You may not, or you may be able to put everything in one place. You may just, all you need is a hot wallet, all you need is a cold wallet. But most organizations need both a hot wallet and a cold wallet. Some organization may say that some assets may need to be segregated from other assets. So you may need even to have two hot wallets. You can do that for a couple of reasons. One is you have two different business lines, and they cannot be commingled. You may say, like, maybe I will put only a certain value maximum on a hot wallet or a cold wallet, and when it exceeds that number, I'll have to transfer things to another wallet. Why? Because if one was compromised, then I haven't compromised everything. You may want to have one for a contingency. Let's say I had, as I'm planning for a potential compromise, maybe I have a cold wallet that's just sitting and available, or maybe I use a third-party contingency providers. Think about reusability. Why? Because you may have different processes as well, right? So in this example that's shown, some of the pieces are reused. For instance, records and transaction formatting. But you may have two different business lines that have two different compliance processes, or potentially two different risk processes. So by thinking about reusability and thinking about segregation, you're going to give yourself abilities to create more and potentially new products in the future, and give yourself the ability to be adaptive, not only from a security side, but also in a product availability and being able to get into the market quickly. So we talked about, a framework, and that framework in the end is there to build opportunities. And opportunities are the services that you want to provide to yourself and to your clients. So you have oversight, you have safekeeping, you have utility. And given that, and you build a strategic plan, that's going to create opportunities that are in the market. And when you work it through, you want to start thinking about a crawl, walk, run. As the line kind of shows you, it's actually hard in the beginning. That's the toughest time, almost any of this stuff. Getting started is the challenging part. But once you get started, it gets a lot easier. So build out basic services, just, buy and hold, don't transfer to others, right? And so very simplistic model. Eventually you want to go into asset movements. You may want to provide now value-added services that are aligned to the services that you're offering. And we can think about lots of other opportunities around asset servicing, around asset active and passive investments. You may want to do self-investing if you're doing for your own investment within your own institution, have prime services. And these force you to have and build new capabilities around partnerships, around extending your traditional services, around connectivities and such. And finally, you're getting to things around stable coins and other things in metaverse. Again, we'll build new capabilities. As long as you think about this in a crawl, walk, run, we'll be in a good shape. So to conclude, there's a lot of things to think about, and we certainly didn't cover them all. But if you focus on the basics and do that well in the beginning, that's the biggest challenge, just getting started. Build it against a framework that you can understand, build security by design from the beginning, think about reusability and components like the enterprise architects and such, and your engineers should think about where your future and start giving them an idea where this is going, and leverage your core capabilities. The market is changing. We still don't know where everything will happen. We have a good idea of the kinds of capabilities that we need to build. So maintain awareness, engage with regulators, see where that the trend is going around that, maintain market awareness. Finally, extend your offering. We talked about crawl, walk, run, develop capabilities, start easy, move on, keep on building, get talent, whether you hire your own talent or you outsource talent, build partnerships, technologies, and build strategically, right? That's what we talked about, reusability. Thank you very much.
So I think we're going to move on to questions. Thank you so much, Yair. That was super insightful. For me personally, I really took to the proactive security comment you made around MPC. I think it's a common theme for the day. We heard about it this morning as we think about the opportunity that the technology presents in actually doing proactive security on-chain. But the fact that you can also do proactive security at the key layer and maintain continuity of public addresses is pretty amazing. We'll move to questions that we got from the audience. The first one here is, are activities of a digital asset custodian insurable? If yes, does that mean, and can that be contextualized as a backstop?
So when we think about risk, one of the things insurance is considered transfer risk. And there are insurance policies. And I won't talk about specific vendors, but both custodians tend to have insurance on them. And if you're using a sub-custodian, you certainly should ask the question of what is their insurance protection that they have. They tend to have it different between hot and cold wallet as well. And many of the software vendors and technology vendors that you may use for your own self-custody also have a relationship with insurance companies, and there is insurance clauses around that. I'm not an insurance expert, but insurance it's sort of like a cyber insurance that's in the market, but you need to think about it very specifically in the type of what you need for the type of custody assets that you're having, and realize that it's typically different types of insurance and different levels between hot and cold wallet.
Yeah, I'll also add that there's multiple layers when we think about insurance too. So outside of the insurance that the vendor might carry, there's also asset level, right? So they might make a distinction depending on the type of asset or the blockchain that it sits on top of, right? And then you can go further into the operations of the network, where we're starting to see some emergence of this now, where the insurance sector is starting to provide protection services at the node infrastructure level. The Block Damon Marsh example, to name one. Okay, next question here. What is EY's view on regulation for the industry? Have there been a number of rug pulls in the past that has resulted in people losing their life earnings? Or there have been, obviously. Yes.
Yeah. So, as was mentioned earlier, I'm fairly new in the organization. I've been here only a few months. But I think everybody is looking to see where the trend is. Like, we believe, as many do, that this is an area where regulators take their time. They want to understand it. They want to make good decisions. But there has been some regulatory decisions, and there have been regulatory white papers and conversations that have happened. One is, you have to think about this not only from a U.S. perspective, yet it's an international perspective, right? And we're seeing it move in different places. My guess is we're seeing that, we're going to see more regulatory oversight. They're going to want to have greater level of consumer protection. But where that falls into place, and around things like sanctions and anti-money laundering and consumer protection and such, I think it's still an area to be seen.
Thanks, Hier. Yeah, and there's a lot going on there, and I think one of the other things you mentioned, maintaining awareness. So you're just fostering a habit of education, and that's why we as EY are offering these master classes as part of our summit. It's so fundamental, right, to educate the broader public on the considerations here, so you can make better decisions and hopefully avoid some of these unfortunate cases of rug pulls where people are losing their life earnings. And that's going to be an ongoing thing. Next question: why does there need to be an independent record keeping when the data is on the blockchain?
So the question is more around, where are your records, right? So when you think about an institution, the typical thing that ends up happening is you have clients and you have your own books and records, right? So you probably have your own system maintaining its own books and records. So people are debiting and crediting all the time. There are fees that you have to manage. And that system connects to the wallet. And the wallet itself also needs to keep track of what all the assets are. And those two, you want to make sure are aligned, right? Because your backend, which may be the one that you've gone to regulator and says, this is my books and records, right? Now your wallet may be provided to you by a third party, and it may be another piece of software, and it may be regularly looking at the blockchain, but again, it too could potentially get compromised. Not necessarily the keys, but another aspect of it. So then you have the blockchain, which has its own data and where the information is. And the point here around reconciliation is, it would be good that all three are aligned, right? That should there be a compromise in your wallet, your backend record keeping, that maybe your official books and records are aligned, and that you're always making sure that the real truth of source, right? Source of truth is the blockchain. That's the real one, but the other ones that you're using as you're running your business also should be aligned to that source of truth. And should there be a misalignment, then you have to understand, like, whatever is on the blockchain, that's what you have. If you're short in your books and record, the real value is what's going to be on the blockchain, and you will have to reconcile and determine how to manage that.
Yeah, and it's not to say that blockchains aren't faulty, right? People can still execute a faulty transaction to a blockchain ledger, right?
That's correct. Yeah, and again, having been in the financial industry, reconciliation is a difficult thing, and it's always about, you have different systems all trying to keep the same level of record at different time frames. And one has to realize that even in like a Bitcoin, it'll take you an hour, to get all the confirmations, for instance, right? So just managing all of that, it's a good process to be able to ensure that, you're reconciling, you're checking your confirmations, depending on the sophistication or however you keep your books and record, all of those have to be eventually in the end of the day or some point in time of the day, ensure that you have confirmed that they are all aligned.
Yeah, and one thing I think we've explored is just in terms of operations, right? Banking hours are very different than blockchain hours, right? It's they don't
Yes.
run 24/7, so one is end of day, and that's where you may need to have some of this reconciliation too as you look day to day.
Yeah. I wanted to just add one other point is that, some people in some systems, I've talked to several, have built very traditional systems for their banking, and then they go into blockchain and they realize, wow, this is a big decimal point that our system doesn't manage. So you also have to sort of think about it in how you're reconciling, because you sometimes have to manage that legacy systems don't always align to a blockchain. And this is, again, in the same context of, it's not the same hours, it's not the same flow, it's not the same kind of settlement process, that that reconciliation helps you ensure that you're always looking at a constant truth.
Great, thank you. Your next one is, what is the difference between a non-custodial wallet and a self-custody wallet?
So self-custody, well, I think, a non-custodial is when I'm holding it, right? In a self-custody, you can look at it as a non-custodial wallet. I guess it depends it's in the context of whether the entity yourself is holding it as a custodian. I think those terms are not standardized.
Yeah, typically we've seen self-custody, meaning an institution may want to bring that custody capability in-house, and they would use a technology provider to potentially help them do that, versus versus using something that may be more open source from a end consumer perspective. Next one is, do we have an initiative in regards to auditing consortium blockchains?
I'm not aware.
I think we had one more question, but I think it's like it got removed. I think that brings us to the end here. Yer, thank you so much. I always learn a little bit more when I have you speaking and sharing your knowledge. But it's been great.
Great, thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. Today we have an exciting closing keynote for you. With us today, we have Adam Levine. Adam is a VP and head of corporate strategy at Fireblocks, the leading digital asset technology infrastructure provider with over 1,200 institutional clients globally. Adam's team leads new ventures, strategic partnerships, and non-crypto digital asset initiatives at Fireblocks. And they so happen to also use the MPC technology that we were just talking about with a year earlier. With that, I'll welcome Adam here, joining us over Zoom. Adam, over to you.
Excellent.
Talk about our banks, how they're reinventing themselves.
Perfect. Thank you, and really appreciate EY for this opportunity. And today we're excited just to talk to you a little bit about how we're seeing banks reinvent themselves as we focus on digital assets. So first off, just a little bit of context, not to be a sales approach at all, but just to understand Fireblocks. As said in the intro, we are the leading digital asset infrastructure provider. Today we have over 1,200, almost 1,300 institutional clients globally. We've settled over $2.5 trillion in assets, and we're now over 400 people. And you see here a quick shot of our three co-founders, all with really excellent, very strong cyber security experience, and none of them are first-time founders. And this is quite important as we think about Fireblocks. Just a bit about our background. We've been around a little over 3 years, live in the market, and really fortunate with the variety of investors, both the early stage, the digital asset focused investors, some of the late stage and crossover, as well as strategic investors. The headquarters of the company is in New York, although the real strength comes from our R&D team out in Tel Aviv. And when we think about the customer segments that we support, you see it really is a variety of the B2B space, and banks, custodians, and many more. And just want to quickly give a snapshot here of the different types of liquidity providers and market makers, lending providers. Many of the even retail institutions that you may be comfortable and familiar with are actually powered by Fireblocks behind the scene. But it's not just the crypto native and those that are focused in the neobank space. But as you see in the top right around the banking and custody, banks like Bank von der Heid and BNY Mellon that are hundreds of years old are also coming to work with Fireblocks. And we're quite excited about the variety of clients that we support. But enough about Fireblocks. This is really about what we're seeing in the space as banks are looking to reinvent themselves and future-proof what they're trying to achieve. And so for today's agenda, you see 3 points here, and we're going to start with the first one, that the momentum is not coming, we're there, right? We're really seeing it right now. Here is the time to be thinking about what to do with digital assets. And then later on, we'll talk a bit about what we're seeing as successful strategy, right? And it's not just about custody. And those that are looking to solve just custody are really not satisfying what clients are looking for. And then we thought it'd be helpful to give a little bit of detail about some specific use cases that we're seeing today in the banking community. So for context, the early days, right? Many people, their first experience with Bitcoin is thinking about Somali pirates and North Korean hackers, or hearing about their computer being hacked and they have to somehow get this crazy cryptocurrency. And that was their first experience, right? It was really more dark web or nefarious players. And obviously that's evolved quite a lot. And you see the beautiful picture of the mountains there. The idea of cold storage, many people quite literally held their assets on some type of hardware device in a vault, and sometimes literally up in the mountains, far away, disconnected from internet, disconnected from anything at all. It really has evolved quite a lot since then. I think most people are aware, but we still hear from certain banks of, right, is this really a technology that people are using, or is it still that stigma from the early around 2015 or even 2017 days? So the big thing is you no longer get to doubt about digital and crypto assets. There was a while where the industry was saying, is it a thing? Is it a fad? Notwithstanding the recent news from the last week or two, digital assets are here. And they're really, really credible, relevant, and a significant part of society. And so those that doubted, this is not like doubting whether or not unicorns exist. This is about doubting whether currency exists, right? The digital assets are increasingly relevant, but we're still in the early stages. And from a technology perspective, there are certain similarities that you've seen in internet or cloud technology, where there's rapid maturation and innovation in the space, which is very exciting. It's really great to see that the level of innovation has not plateaued. We're going to continue to get there, but most importantly, we've hit a level of maturity where there's security and strength and resiliency that's allowing many in the mainstream traditional financial services to jump in with a degree of comfort, whether it's leveraging that MPC technology that was referenced earlier or other types of technology. But it's important to be aware that it's not a fully mature level of tech, just that it's at a very high level right now. But most importantly, we really do see the future of financial services as powered by digitized or tokenized assets. So shares of IBM, blocks of gold, the currency that's currently in your physical wallet, we do see a future where all of that will have a digitized or tokenized version. It may not fully replace the versions that we're all accustomed to today, but in some cases it will. And it's the same technology that's powering those cryptocurrencies that will be powering the traditional financial assets that we all leverage today. And you see just one report from the Federal Reserve at the bottom about explosive growth. Right at the end of Q3 of last year, they referenced over $130 billion in stablecoins with a tremendous rate of growth and increase in just 1 year. And obviously, there was some news in the last few weeks around algorithmic stablecoins, but this is a trend that we see that will be surviving. And we could talk more during Q&A, but the level of stablecoin adoption continues to increase. So knowing that digital assets are here, it's important to think about some specific examples, right? And here are some headlines that we think are quite interesting and good indicators of where the market is. First off, 401k accounts accessing crypto, right? This is an important step. There's a tremendous amount of investment and wealth in retirement funds that have been begging to get some access to cryptocurrency and exposure. And Fidelity took an important step not that long ago into the space. And obviously, you'll see places like the hedge funds that are always going after alpha and see another asset class really pouring in a lot of money, not just hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars. But there's a few other indicators that we think of as really important to understand that this is not just for the hedge funds, but the traditional financial services. And so one, I often point to the bank consortia of USDF. So this is a consortia of banks in the US, and this is not the world's leading global players. It's not the JP Morgans and Goldmans and Citis of the world, but smaller regional players, national players that have come together to create a new stablecoin that is the closest you can get to being backed by the FDIC. So for those not familiar, FDIC insurance gives a level of federal protection in the event of a loss of asset up to a certain dollar amount. And so this consortium has come together and effectively has created a stablecoin that is backed by every coin is backed by $1 in an FDIC insured account. This is not the same thing as FDIC insurance, but a really important signal that you're seeing some smaller regional players, not the sort of names you see on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the FT, putting in a tremendous amount of resources to create stablecoins because they see that this is the way of the future. And another great example there on the bottom right is SWIFT, right? When you think about traditional financial services, SWIFT is incredibly important, systemically important in many jurisdictions. And they as well are looking and taking steps to leverage digital assets, right? Not all of them are about crypto, but finding these examples where you're seeing traditional financial services needs to be a wake-up call to everyone that this is not a fad, that there are some real use cases leveraging this exact technology, whether it's looking for traditional banks like Commerce Bank getting into crypto, or looking at things that would otherwise seem boring around using stablecoin payments or tokenizing assets to move them around. All these use cases are really good examples that digital assets are here and that the number of use cases are going to continue to proliferate. And just to give a bit more context about where we are today, it's possible the stablecoin valuation has dropped a bit between this presentation and today because of the news a few weeks ago, but still over $100 billion in stablecoin payments. But as mentioned before, we're seeing this in commodities, we're seeing this in debt issuances and equity securities as well. And the reason for this is because it allows you to move assets in a quicker, safer, less risky way. And so we expect that we're going to continue to see the use cases in commodities. The number of debt issuances is still relatively low on a tokenized and digitized way. But as we've seen with the European Investment Bank and their bond issuance and others, there's increasingly an appetite for debt issuances, and same with equity, to be leveraging this technology. And the regulation continues to catch up to this. And we'll speak a little bit more about regulation. But as you start to see this page, there's an opportunity for you to say, wow, those are nice numbers, but they're a bit small, right? Thinking about an FX market that's between $6 and $10 trillion a day, this isn't that much. But the level of adoption continues to grow at a rapid rate, as we saw earlier. Thinking about the opportunities, and as more of the traditional players adopt the technology, they're going to be able to tap into different use cases and appreciate the fact that this technology allows them to do things in a quicker, simpler way. We expect these numbers to really increase quite rapidly. So mentioned before, but really a lot of this comes down to payments, right? And for institutions like yourself, it's important to think about, well, what's going to be different? Why would I want to use stable coins, right? Fiat rails work, they're pretty traditional. But we consistently hear from participants and our clients that they think about quicker settlement times, they think about reducing their transaction cost, and they think about lower risk, right? These three motivations are incredibly powerful. Thinking about an opportunity to be able to move an asset like a dollar or a euro much faster, not paying for the incredibly high wire fees or having to wait 2 to 4 business days for a transaction to move is important to them. Many people are used to the idea of going out for dinner with friends and using PayPal or Venmo to be able to make a payment instantly. And then they ask how come their banks can't do that same thing for them? Why do they have to pay outrageous fees or wait 2 to 4 business days for something to settle? Really feels outmoded. And this is where it's an opportunity for the traditional players, especially banks, to take advantage of this technology and be able to provide an important value add for their clients, be able to reduce the risk, reduce their fees, and actually know with certainty that we're seeing transactions settle faster. And this is not an academic discussion. As you see on the right side, there are many players that are already taking steps, traditional players like Visa and MasterCard, and some of the larger, more established fintechs like PayPal and Stripe. And many of this is starting in the retail side. So checkout.com and Mercado Libre in Latin America are seeing opportunities where their merchants are expressing interest in either accepting cryptocurrencies or stablecoins. So this continues to be a movement that we're seeing, not just on the retail side, but the retail wallets are the ones that are speaking with their money, speaking with their voices quite loudly, that they see this as an opportunity that they need to solve today. And then another trend to be thinking about is DeFi, or decentralized finance. This is an area that's growing tremendously over the last few years. For those that are not familiar with DeFi, it's the opportunity to do that peer-to-peer financial services of interest earning, borrowing, lending, and trading all via public blockchains. And the level of adoption really has grown quite significantly over the last few years, as you see with some of the numbers on the bottom left of the slide. Now, for banks, the opportunity there is that they want access either for them or for their clients to get those higher yields. And the obvious question is, well, who's on the other side of those transactions? And how do I know it's not an institution that I'd be prevented from working with? But the technology around AML and OFAC screening, et cetera, and even cases of permission DeFi have helped address this. And we've seen this live in the market now, where regulated institutions can help either for themselves or for their clients get access to these DeFi pools in a permission way, leveraging this technology and really providing an important value add for their service. And you see the reference there at the bottom from Chainalysis, that the level of the transactions really just in the last few years has been growing quite significantly. So the next thing is thinking about your strategy, right? And we emphasize that clients are really looking for more than custody. Many institutions have been hesitant, especially banks have been hesitant to move into digital assets. And when they finally do, they say, great, I'll let my clients hold their cryptocurrency. This is an important step, it's fundamental, but this also solves the problem probably of 2018, maybe 2019, right? Clients now are much more sophisticated on the retail and institutional level, and they want access to all the wonderful opportunities of what digital assets have. And so when we work with banks, and we've seen this in many instances, custody may be what they want to start with, but having that vision to be able to help their clients do much more is absolutely critical. But when it comes to this, the first thing traditional financial services providers think about is regulation, and for quite good reason. There's a lack of clarity there, especially depending on the jurisdictions where you operate. Now, as we work with global regulators, we're not a regulated institution, but as we talk to those that are regulated and the regulators themselves, we see certain themes, specifically that regulators are going to regulate activity and not technology, right? It's not that regulators will outlaw blockchain or digital assets, but the type of technology and how that technology is used are two very different things. Now, thinking a bit about developed versus emerging markets, our expectation is that we're going to continue to see the developed markets move more or less in unison, a consensus approach. And this is often the case. Inherently, there's some nuances with certain jurisdictions, but by and large, the more developed markets tend to get to similar positions because they are concerned about similar systemic risks, and they want to make sure there's not a regulatory arbitrage. The thing to consider is that we are going to see very, very different expectations from emerging markets and not necessarily moving in any specific trend, right? We're going to see the extremes of China and India on one side and El Salvador and Ukraine quite literally on the opposite side. And it's not going to be just based on how big you are or certain geographic regions. And this is something that regulated institutions do need to think about. However, as we put on the bottom of the slide, an important leading indicator is looking at what the regulators themselves are doing. With over 87 central banks today exploring some version of CBDC, central banks do not have unlimited resources, right? They really need to be quite frugal with what they experiment with and what they say to the market. And the fact that such a high number are in a variety of stages, from launching central bank digital currency, exploring, working on POCs with one another and with the private sector, is a really good indication that regulation is going to get comfortable with digital asset technology. So thinking about the banks, I emphasize that you need some vision with your strategy. Depending on where you fit and where your clients fit, here are some of the key points that we think about. So DeFi is a trend for buy side, sell side, and the corporates as well. But as you notice here, for the banks, custody may be foundational, but it's really just one use case. Looking at opportunities for banks to think about how they're going to be a market maker. They may be familiar with this in other asset classes. Cryptocurrencies is another opportunity there. Similar for those on the retail. And tokenization is something that we'll talk about a bit later, but a really important opportunity for banks to work with their clients on tokenizing assets as they want to access the capital market. And a bit more detail about sort of the foundation of where it comes. We do believe that everything you do with digital assets starts with having a secure infrastructure. Obviously, it all starts with having the ability to hold an asset, but you need to be able to hold that asset in the safest, most secure way. And leveraging the new technologies no longer makes you choose between that cold storage in a vault or that image of the mountains from the beginning versus the ability to move it, right? Leveraging MPC technology and other types of security layers allow banks to be able to help their clients move digital assets safely, but in a secure manner. And then from there, banks can layer that on with connectivity to the crypto market, thinking about compliance, AML, OFAC, and other types of concerns, and then being able to scale this, right? The level of transactions that blockchains can support continues to increase. And it is a technology that must be sufficiently robust to help the banks empower their clients with their use cases. So it's really important as you think about your strategy about what you want to support, starting with that secure infrastructure and then layering on these capabilities on top. And so some of the very basic questions that we work with clients on is thinking about, first, how are crypto and digital assets going to impact your line of business? Right? Every bank knows what they do very well today and should spend time thinking about, are they going to be disrupted? Are they going to be replaced in some way? Or could they take advantage of the technology to prevent that from happening? Right? And thinking about how digitizing or tokenizing assets will impact each business line for you. And the last part is, what role do you want to play? There's an opportunity for banks to play similar roles they do today with the new technology. But as you work through the impacts, it's important for you to understand that some of the roles banks perform today may not be the same type of role in the future with digital assets. And it should not just take such a short-term view of assuming it's new technology and I'll continue to play the same roles, because this technology really does allow you to do different things. And the encouragement that we have is that it's no longer the time to be a not so fast follower, right? This is the time to be thinking about a longer term strategy and start to take some real demonstrative steps. The reactive approach that we've seen from others of, let's just open up some wallets for our clients and let them hold their assets with us, has proven from many to not work, right? Because the clients really are sophisticated and looking for access to the DeFi or other value add of digital assets. And so this is where we continue to emphasize for banks to think about that longer term vision of how you're going to be impacted, what role you want to play, and how that technology change can help you execute on that strategy. And then the important thing to think about along the way is that the technology does mean things operate differently. Right? To the extent that your bank decides to get involved in cryptocurrencies, it's a truly 24/7 market. Foreign exchange operates, 24/5.5, right? But cryptocurrencies are literally any hour, any day. And understanding that there's really not centralized markets, right? Although there is CeFi and DeFi, the decentralization of cryptocurrency is significantly different. And the speed with which assets can settle, while it's an advantage, you need to have the systems, the security and operations to support all of that. Our emphasis, though, is the technology itself can be quite sophisticated, but that does not inherently mean that it's very expensive to implement and that it's a complex set of IT and support and operations. It just means that it's different. It's different skill sets, it's different security protocols and measures that you need to be thinking about. But in many instances, it could actually be more cost effective. And so spending time as a bank to think through what those differences will really be quite important for you. I do want to be conscious of the time here. So these are some suggestions just of ways that we've seen others implement their strategy, thinking about building their digital asset rails, starting to enrich it with other functionality. And then there's even more that you can do from there. And the balance, of course, is how quickly you want to get to market. But as the technology matures, it really does become increasingly easy to be able to deliver these. And then I'll briefly touch on tokenization and make sure I leave some time for questions. But tokenization, first off, it's the definition you see there is the process of using blockchain technology to issue tokens that could represent a right of ownership of a physical or digital asset, right? The tokenization could be stablecoin, theoretically a dollar or another type of fiat currency. It can be real estate, it can be a commodity, equity, and debt as well. And we see examples of all of that today. And thinking that the main question is like, yes, I've heard about tokenization thousands of times. Why are people doing that? What's different? You see right here the opportunity for, again, much quicker settlement time, a global reach, and fewer intermediaries, which inherently can mean less risk and less cost as you think about the opportunities of being able to move the digitized assets on a blockchain. And that transparency is absolutely key. Of course, there's still opportunity for confidentiality, but being able to identify that the assets have moved in a transparent manner is really quite important. And ultimately, you have that opportunity due to the fractionalization of tokens to be able to hit a larger investor base, which for many clients of banks is going to be their ultimate goal. And tokenization continues to increase in frequency. Just over the last 5 years, it felt a bit esoteric in a few test cases, but the World Bank in 2018 and BBVA showing some leadership to most recently ANZ in Australia issuing Aussie dollar stablecoins, and FIS allowing USDC for its merchants. It's demonstrating that we're continuing to see popularity in tokenization. Very conscious of time, so I want to blow through some of these slides a little bit quicker. But again, the highlights here about tokenization are focused on the increased investor base, increased liquidity, accessing the global markets. And all of this ultimately is going to unlock what in some cases are illiquid markets. And you have this opportunity to layer on top of that meeting your ESG investment goals, especially thinking about the social and governance components of it, and tapping into a much larger market. And as you see the report from McKinsey at the bottom, over a third of private market managers are anticipating retail-oriented vehicles. It's really a tremendous opportunity that this technology allows you to empower. And thinking through as a bank, tokenizing fiat currency is a very common use case. Depending on your jurisdiction, may be an opportunity that you want to think about, but also issuing the security tokens and digitized bonds are cases that we continue to see. The banks want to be able to empower their clients, and this is the technology that allows you to do that. And we like to post this specific example here because of ANZ having done this quite recently. They met really with a challenge where they wanted to provide their institutional clients with a gateway to digital assets. And their clients were frustrated with the duration of wires, the limited operating hours, the expenses, and the operational burden. And this is where ANZ, a very established traditional financial service provider, realized that if they could create a true stable coin that was pegged to the Australian dollar, it would really open up a tremendous opportunity for them. Right? And so they were able to reduce transfers that would have taken 24 to 48 hours to just about 30 minutes. They increased their operating hours to 24/7. We're able to do this with our tokenization engine, but of course there are others in the market as well. And you see the quote in the bottom there. This is really an opportunity for banks to think about how they want to help empower their clients transact in a more efficient way. Leveraging this technology really becomes a phenomenal opportunity for banks as they want to help empower their clients. So with that said, hopefully that was helpful. I know a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but to give some insights in terms of how we think about banks should be approaching the technology. I'm happy if there's any questions to help address them.
Yeah, they all just started flooding in, so we'll see how many we can get through before we're out of time. Thank you so much,
Excellent.
Adam. So the first one here is, are bank stablecoins against the spirit of decentralized coins like Bitcoin?
So they both leverage the same technology, right? The libertarian view of a scenario where banks are no longer necessary and everything can be democratized is probably more in the spirit of how Bitcoin was initially created. But all the advantages of that technology and leveraging that for stablecoins is absolutely consistent with the tech, right? This is not a decision on do you need to be libertarian or not. We really focus on the fact that this technology can help banks and help market participants do things quicker, safer, cheaper. And so therefore we do think it's consistent.
Okay. Next one is, considering how DeFi is heavily tied to TradFi, what future do you see on the mainstream adoption of DeFi, and what should happen for us to get there?
Yeah, I think permission DeFi is going to be quite important for regulated institutions. So we work with Aave Arc and help ensure that the types of institutions that are in those DeFi pools have met a level of KYC, right? So the extreme, you don't want to be trading against Bashar al-Assad's bank for all sorts of AML OFAC reasons. As we see more permission DeFi institutions leveraging the tech and knowing they're playing in a safer space, we are going to continue to see what we've seen already of increased adoption from traditional players.
So I'm going to jump ahead a couple here in the interest of time to a related question. What benefits of open permissionless DeFi is retained in permission DeFi?
You're leveraging the same idea of fewer intermediaries, right? That peer-to-peer lending, right? And therefore there's an opportunity to get what may feel like either outsized or increased rates of return because there's fewer intermediaries in the way. But when it's in a permission basis, there are still some safeguards that may not be the same when it's truly open and permissionless.
And then last one I'll take here, and then I have one more follow-up personally. But this one is with the examples of companies like Venmo or PayPal that are already allowed transfer of assets between people or friends, what would be the advantage of a company using blockchain?
I think that there's a few. First, just in the retail space, being able to do payments, as we've seen with Checkout.com, Mercado Libre, on the retail use case, getting those assets there much quicker and cheaper than you would see, and you're not limited to just one service provider when you open it up to blockchain. The second is on the institutional level. It's really empowering that as individuals, we can make payments virtually instantly with Venmo and PayPal. It's quite frustrating on the institutional level that you can't. And as you leverage the digital assets, being able to do a payment versus payment or a delivery versus payment can be really empowering and less risky for institutional players.
Yeah, I found the stat you flashed up from Chainalysis. I can't believe that was a year ago, that 60% of value is institutional that's feeding into DeFi. I'm sure that number is way up now. My question, and kind of a segue to tomorrow. So you mentioned tokenization quite a bit, but really focused on financial assets. Obviously, this is the track for today. But is there interest that you're seeing too outside of that? You know, we know tokenization can represent physical assets. So have you been seeing any interest with your clients in real world assets?
Absolutely. So thinking about real estate as an obvious opportunity, but also in the entertainment industry, we're seeing certain rights that are being tokenized. Some information will probably coming out in coming months, but there are really unique opportunities to tokenize all sorts of assets. For banks, we think about the traditional financial assets, but definitively it is not limited to those. The opportunity in GameFi and others that we'll be seeing probably in the coming quarters.
Yeah, I'm personally excited about that because I see this convergence, right? The technology serves as this foundation. Even your company's services, right, can serve a lot of that, right, once it's in a tokenized form. So
Absolutely.
super exciting. Adam, I want to be respectful of your time as well. Thank you so much for joining us and supporting today. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Okay, with that, we'd like to thank everybody else for joining today. Please come back tomorrow. We have 2 more exciting days of content to get your fill of blockchain masterclasses. Thanks, everyone.